She was just an art restorer. No gun, no training, no preparation for anything like that night. But when the armed men stormed the museum, when bullets ripped through centuries-old masterpieces, Evelyn Mercer did the only thing she could. She grabbed a knife, slashed the painting from its frame, and ran into the torrential Chicago rain. Then she ran straight to him. Damien Moretti, the city's most feared criminal, and he smiled. This is the story of a woman who stepped into Chicago's darkest world and became the most terrifying thing in it. Which city are you watching from? Please like and comment your city name below to let me know how far this story has come. And don't go anywhere, because from this moment, everything will change. The basement smelled like turpentine and old wood, and the particular kind of silence that only exists when everyone else has gone home. Evelyn Mercer had learned to love that silence, not because she was antisocial, though 3 of her 4 ex-boyfriends would have argued the point, but because silence was honest. Silence didn't pretend. It didn't dress itself up in Friday night neon and cheap perfume and act like everything was fine when the rot was right there beneath the surface, visible to anyone paying attention. Evelyn was always paying attention. She sat on a rolling stool in the conservation lab of the Chicago Museum of Antiquities, her magnification visor pushed up onto her forehead, a Japanese scalpel held loosely between her fingers. The painting she was working on had arrived 3 weeks ago, a supposed mid-16th century Italian portrait donated anonymously through a Zurich-based art trust. The donor's paperwork was immaculate. The provenance documentation was almost too good. That alone had been enough to make her itch. The subject of the portrait was a man in dark velvet, his face unremarkable, the kind of forgettable aristocratic face that Renaissance painters churned out by the dozens for wealthy merchants who wanted to look important. But something about the way the varnish had yellowed in the upper left quadrant bothered her. The aging pattern was slightly off, almost imperceptible, the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't looking at 500 years of brushwork under a 40 times loop every other night. She lowered the visor, clicked on the UV lamp. The painting changed. Under ultraviolet light, the yellowed varnish dissolved into something else entirely. Behind the velvet robes, behind the unremarkable face, numbers bloomed across the canvas like hemorrhages. Column after column of them, rendered in a resin that fluoresced under UV and remained invisible in standard light. Row after row of encrypted sequences, names compressed into alphanumeric strings, dollar figures so large they stopped looking like money and started looking like geography. Evelyn sat very still. She was not a mathematician. She was not an investigator. She was a woman who spent her evenings rescuing dead paintings, and what she was looking at right now had nothing to do with paint. She pulled off her visor, set it on the workbench, picked it back up again, put it on, looked again. Still there. The sequences were organized in tiers, she could see that much. The structure of it reminded her of ledger formatting, the kind she'd seen in historical accounting documents from Florentine trading houses. But these weren't historical. The resin was too recent, the compound too synthetic. Someone had used the painting as a container, had layered this information inside a genuine antique, sealed it beneath fresh varnish with enough skill to fool a casual eye, and then donated it to a public institution where it would sit in a climate-controlled basement for years, accessible to almost no one. Until her. She reached for her phone to photograph the image and stopped. Thought about that. A paranoia she couldn't name settled into her chest like water into a crack, patient and cold. She set the phone down instead, wheeled her stool back from the table, looked at the painting from a distance, like she was trying to see a different painting inside it, the way you could sometimes see an earlier composition showing through when the artist had reused a canvas. That's when she heard the elevator. Not the service elevator. That one groaned and clanked and announced itself like an old man descending stairs. This was the main elevator shaft, the one that served the public galleries above. It was 11:40 on a Friday night. The museum had been closed since 5. The security guard on duty, an older man named Gerald, who brought a thermos of soup and fell asleep in his chair by 9, was 3 floors above her. Evelyn turned off the UV lamp. She sat in the dark for a moment listening. The elevator stopped. She heard the hiss of the doors, then footsteps. Multiple, deliberate, not the shuffling pace of a confused visitor. These were the footsteps of people who knew exactly where they were going. She should have hidden. That was the rational choice, the sensible choice, the choice that any reasonable person would have made. Instead, she turned the UV lamp back on and took 6 photographs with her phone in the span of 4 seconds, moving the lamp angle on the last 2 to capture the column sequences in the lower register that she hadn't fully documented yet. The footsteps were on the stairs now. She killed the lamp, killed the overhead fluorescence, shoved the phone into the back pocket of her jeans. In the dark, she could still see the painting in her mind. Every column, every tier, the particular way the numbers clustered in groups of 7 in the lower third. She had spent 12 years training her memory for visual information. Right now, that training felt less like a professional skill and more like a curse. The conservation lab had 2 exits. The main door, which opened directly onto the basement corridor where the footsteps were getting louder, and the emergency exit on the far wall, a heavy steel door wired to a fire alarm that would scream loud enough to wake half of Lincoln Park the moment it opened. She didn't care about the alarm anymore. She moved to the painting. The scalpel was still in her hand. She'd been holding it this whole time without realizing, her knuckles blanched, the handle slick with palm sweat. She gripped it properly, pressed the blade to the inside edge of the canvas where it met the stretcher bar, and began cutting. The door to the lab opened. There were 3 of them. Dark clothing, no identifying markings, professional in the way that people who got paid to be dangerous were professional, efficient, and unhurried. The first one through the door swept the room with a flashlight beam and caught her immediately. "Don't," he said. 1 syllable. Very calm. Evelyn kept cutting. She was fast with a blade. Restoration work required it, and she'd been doing this since she was 23, which meant she had 15 years of muscle memory in her hands. She cut the bottom edge, moved to the right side, moved to the top. The man with the flashlight crossed the room toward her with the particular urgency of someone who suddenly understood what she was doing. She finished the last cut. The canvas came away from the frame. Not cleanly, not the way she would have done it under controlled circumstances, but it came away. A rolled tension releasing through the old linen. She snatched it from the air as it fell, spun toward the emergency exit, hit the bar with both hands. The alarm detonated through the basement like a physical thing. She was through the door and into the stairwell before the first shot hit the concrete above her head. Not a gun, something suppressed and pneumatic, quieter than she expected. A second impact struck the metal railing beside her hand and threw sparks. She took the stairs by feel in the dark. 3 at a time. The canvas rolled under her arm like a baton, the alarm shrieking above everything. The ground floor exit deposited her into the side alley that ran between the museum's east wing and the limestone wall of the parking structure beside it. The rain hit her immediately. Not polite Chicago drizzle, but the kind of driving February rain that came off Lake Michigan with genuine malice, cold enough to feel like a slap, heavy enough to make the alley look like it was underwater. She ran. She made it approximately 40 feet. The alley ended at a chain-link gate. Beyond the gate, the street. West Kinsey, lit sodium orange, a handful of late-night cabs, and a black armored SUV parked at the curb with its engine running. She hit the gate at full speed, found the latch, found it padlocked. She was going to have to climb it. She stuck the rolled canvas under her jacket against her ribs and got both hands on the chain link. "That will take too long." The voice came from her left, low and accented very faintly. Italian somewhere in the vowels, but worn thin by American years like a coat that had been dry cleaned one too many times. She turned. He was standing beneath a black umbrella 3 feet from the gate, and he was watching her with an expression that she could only describe as patient. Not cold, not threatening, just patient. The way certain predators were patient. The ones that didn't need to chase because they'd already calculated exactly how far you could run. He was tall, dark coat, no tie, collar open. Mid-40s maybe, with the kind of face that could have been carved for a Roman monument. Strong jaw, heavy brow, a scar running through the left eyebrow that should have made him look thuggish, but instead made him look like someone had tried very hard to damage him and mostly failed. He held the umbrella with the lazy ease of a man who had decided the rain didn't apply to him. Behind him, the armored SUV had its rear door open. "They will be through that exit in approximately 90 seconds, he said, glancing back toward the museum. "The men behind you." Evelyn's chest was heaving. She was soaked to the skin. The canvas under her jacket was a rectangular pressure against her ribs. and the alarm was still screaming somewhere above them, muffled by walls and rain and distance. "Who are you?" she said. Not a question, a demand dressed like one. "Someone who has been watching this painting for 2 years," he said, "and you are the conservator who decided to cut it down." He tilted his head and something moved in his eyes. Not amusement exactly, but its cold relative. Evelyn Mercer, 12 years with the museum, published 3 papers on UV reflectography in the Journal of Cultural Heritage. Your father was Arthur Mercer. The past tense landed on her like a physical weight, even though her father was still alive, or had been, the last she'd checked. The way he said it made it sound like something had already ended. "Get in the car," he said. "Absolutely not." "Miss Mercer." He lowered the umbrella slightly, and the rain found the top of his head and darkened his hair. He didn't flinch. The men coming through that door were hired to destroy the painting and leave no evidence that it existed. That category of evidence includes you. From behind her came the crack of the emergency exit hitting the alley wall. She turned. 2 of the 3 were through, sweeping the alley with flashlights. The beams found her in under a second. She heard one of them say something into an earpiece. She turned back. The man with the umbrella was still watching her, still patient. She looked at the car. She looked at the men behind her. She looked at the rolled canvas under her jacket and thought about the columns of numbers she'd photographed, the tiered sequences, the resin that someone had gone to enormous trouble to hide inside a dead man's portrait. "If you try anything—" "I never try anything," he said. "I decide and then I do it." He stepped to the side, clearing her path to the car door. "There's a difference." She ran for the car. She was inside it before she'd fully decided to be, and then the door closed behind her and the rain was a muffled percussion against the armored glass. And the interior smelled like expensive leather and cold air, and something else. Something like cordite that had faded, but not entirely. And she clutched the canvas to her chest like it was the only solid thing left in the world. The man with the umbrella folded it with one precise motion and got in on the other side. The SUV pulled away from the curb. Nobody said anything for almost a full minute. "What is your name?" Evelyn said finally. He was looking at his phone, which was lit with a string of messages she couldn't read from the angle. He didn't look up. "Damien," he said. She waited. "Damien Moretti." Evelyn knew that name. Everyone in Chicago knew that name, the way everyone in Chicago knew the names of the lakefront winds and the most dangerous intersections on the south side and the particular color the sky turned before a bad storm. Not from close experience, but as geography, as background fact, as a thing that shaped the city around it without being visible. She looked at the man sitting 3 feet away from her in the back of an armored vehicle, in the rain, on a Friday night in February, and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not fear, or not only fear, curiosity. It made her want to slap herself. "You said you've been watching the painting for 2 years," she said. "That means you knew it was there when it was donated." "Yes." "You knew what was inside it." He set his phone down and looked at her directly for the first time since she'd gotten in the car. His eyes were darker than she'd expected. Not dramatically dark, just deeper set, heavier lidded, the kind of eyes that collected information and released very little of it. "I knew what the painting contained," he said. "I did not know what you would find when you looked at it with your lamp. That was an unexpected development." "Unexpected meaning you didn't plan for it. Unexpected meaning it changed everything," he said. The SUV turned. Outside, the sodium lights of West Kinsey gave way to the darker streets of the warehouse district, and Evelyn watched the museum shrink behind them in the rain and felt the strange, particular loneliness of watching the only place that had ever made complete sense to her disappear into the dark. "What's in the ledger?" she said. Silence for 3 beats. "Names," he said. "Whose names?" He turned back to the window. "That," he said, "is what is going to get you killed." She would learn over the next 24 hours that Damien Moretti said exactly what he meant, always, and wasted no additional words on the subject. It was one of the most unsettling things about him. She had met men who were economical with language because they had nothing to say. He was economical with language because he had calculated the precise weight of every word he was willing to give away. and he kept the rest locked behind something that looked like calm and felt, if you were paying close attention, like barely contained pressure. She paid close attention. It was her profession. They drove for 11 minutes before the SUV pulled into the underground garage of a building she didn't recognize, a converted industrial structure somewhere in the West Loop, the kind of building that looked abandoned from the street and was almost certainly not. The garage was clean and warm and held 4 additional vehicles, all of them dark and armored. 2 men in coats were already waiting at the elevator. "Where are we?" she said. "Somewhere you can dry off," Damien said. "That's not an answer. It's the only answer you need right now." She stayed in the car for 2 extra seconds just to establish that she was making a choice, and then she got out. The apartment above was 3 floors up, and not what she had expected. She had expected the aesthetic language of organized crime, heavy furniture, gold fixtures, the kind of aggressive luxury that was really just insecurity in an expensive suit. What she got instead was spare and cold and almost monastic. Concrete floors, dark walls, a long table that held maps and laptops and printed documents she couldn't read from across the room. The bookshelves ran floor to ceiling and held actual books, cracked spines, annotated margins visible from where she stood. One enormous window looked north toward the river. A woman emerged from a side room, compact, 40-something, moving with the economic efficiency of someone who treated every action as a potential combat situation. She handed Evelyn a thick towel without making eye contact and disappeared again. Evelyn pressed the towel to her face. The canvas was still under her jacket, damp now at the edges but intact. She pulled it out and unrolled it on the table, and even in the low light she could see the damage. Her cuts had been clean, but the top right corner had caught on something during the chase and torn through approximately 2 inches of the painted surface. The man's velvet collar was gone, some of his face. She looked at the damage and felt the old professional grief settle in her chest, the particular despair of destruction that couldn't be undone. "You can feel bad about the painting later," Damien said from somewhere behind her. She turned. He had removed his coat. The shirt beneath was white, now very slightly wrinkled, his forearms bare, and she saw the scar that ran from his right wrist to just below the elbow, old and white, and made by something that had applied sustained, deliberate pressure. She looked away. "The photographs on your phone," he said. "I need them." "No." He looked at her with the expression of a man who had not been told no very often and was deciding how to file the experience. "I'm not working for you," she said. "I'm not giving you anything. I'm here because the alternative was getting shot in an alley, and that doesn't make me your employee or your informant or your—" "Sit down, Ms. Mercer." "I'm standing." His jaw moved very slightly. Not a clench. Something quieter than that, an internal adjustment. "The ledger in that painting," he said, "contains 12 years of financial records for an organization called the Moretti Circle. Money laundering routes, offshore accounts, political payments, contracted killings." He paused. "And the proof that at least 6 people currently serving federal prison sentences were framed by someone inside that organization to protect its interests." Evelyn went still. "My organization," he said, "or what people assume is my organization. The name is mine. The crimes were not all mine. You're going to tell me you're innocent. I'm going to tell you that the truth is considerably more complicated than innocent," he said, "and that the men who came into your basement tonight were not trying to protect me. They were trying to protect someone who has been using my family's name as a shield for 2 decades. She looked at the painting on the table, at the damaged velvet, the half-destroyed face, the columns of numbers that nobody was supposed to find. She thought about her father, the past tense in Damien's voice, the particular weight of it. "You said my father's name earlier," she said. "Arthur Mercer." Something shifted in his face. "Not much. Just enough." "What does my father have to do with this?" she said. He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she understood the silence was not evasion. It was preparation. He was choosing how much to give her, the way she sometimes chose how much UV light to apply before a varnish layer started to lift. "I don't know yet," he said finally. "That's the truth. Some of the sequences in the lower register of the ledger are keyed to an external reference I haven't been able to decode. He looked at the painting. Your photographs might help, or they might make things considerably worse. For who? For both of us, he said, equally. Outside, the rain intensified against the north window. The river below was black and moving fast, the way rivers moved when the snow upstream was melting and they were carrying more weight than anyone had designed them for. She looked at her phone, looked at Damien Moretti, looked at the ruined painting on the table between them. She thought about 12 years of silent Friday nights in a basement, the piece of work that asked nothing of her except her hands and her attention. She thought about the alarm still screaming somewhere behind her in the rain. She thought about the three men in dark clothing with their pneumatic professional weapons. She thought, you cannot restore what you refuse to look at. She unlocked her phone. She placed it on the table, photographs open, and Damien Moretti looked down at the screen, and the expression that crossed his face was not satisfaction or triumph. It was the particular look of a man who has just found the thing he was afraid of finding. What is it? She said. He pointed to the lower right sequence on the third photograph, the columns she'd captured with the angled UV lamp, the ones she'd almost missed. This string, he said, this reference code. He tapped the screen. I recognize it. She leaned closer. It's a case number, he said, a federal case number, from 1998. She looked up. His face had gone very still, not calm, still. The way a body of water went still when something was moving through it from below. A conviction, he said quietly. Wrongful, as it turns out. The man served 19 years. He was released 14 months ago. The rain on the window, the river below, the damaged painting on the table. Evelyn's voice came out very flat and very quiet. What was his name? She said. Damien looked at her, and she already knew. She knew the way you knew certain things before they were said, because the body understood before the mind caught up, because some truths were too large to fit inside a sentence and had to be felt first. Arthur Mercer, Damien said. The walls of the apartment did not move. The floor did not shift. But something tipped inside her chest, some internal architecture that had been balancing carefully for years, and the weight of it landing was enormous and quiet and absolutely complete. Her father had not been a criminal. He had been made into one, and the proof had been hidden inside a Renaissance painting, sealed beneath varnish that only she knew how to remove, waiting 14 months for someone with her exact skill set and her exact history to find it. She looked at Damien Moretti's face, at the man who had 2 years of surveillance on this painting, who had known this evidence existed, who had watched and waited and said nothing. You knew, she said. I suspected, he said. There's a difference. Not to him there isn't. His eyes dropped, just briefly, just enough to tell her that the words had found purchase somewhere. Why didn't you get someone to look at the painting yourself, she said. 2 years. Why did you wait? Because the person who hid that ledger knows the names of every conservator I could have hired. They would have known what I was looking for. They would have moved it. He looked at her. But you weren't a move anyone anticipated. You were an accident. She was shaking. She hadn't noticed until this moment. A fine, bone-level tremor, the kind that came from cold and adrenaline and the specific impact of understanding things you can't un-understand. I need you to help me decode the rest of these sequences, Damien said. I'm a conservator, she said. I preserve things. I don't... You understand encryption structures, he said. Your paper in 2019. Decoding concealed information in layered oil media. I read it. He paused. 3 times. She stared at him. I need someone who can read the painting the way it was meant to be read, he said. Not as a crime document, as an art object. The person who built this ledger thought like an archivist. They used archival logic, double encoding, layered reference, chronological sequencing. He tapped the photographs again. I have people who can break cipher. I don't have anyone who can read the container. Outside, a phone in the adjacent room began to ring. The compact woman's voice answered it in low, rapid Italian. A pause. Then footsteps crossing quickly to the main room. She appeared in the doorway with an expression that Evelyn was beginning to understand meant, something has happened that changes our situation. There's a problem, she said to Damien. There's always a problem. This one is at the museum. Gerald's dead. A pause. They're saying gas leak. The particular flatness in how she said it communicated that no one in this room was under the illusion that it was a gas leak. Damien turned back to Evelyn. Something in his face had changed. The patience was still there, but it had been redistributed, compressed into a smaller space behind his eyes, making room for something more operational. "The men who came for the painting tonight will not stop," he said. "They know you found it. They know you ran. They do not know what you photographed or what you remember, but they will spend significant resources finding out." He looked at her steadily. "You cannot go home. You cannot go to the police. 2 of the department's senior officers appear in the first column of that ledger. You cannot contact colleagues or friends without putting them at risk." Evelyn looked at the canvas on the table, at the photographs on her phone, at the man standing across from her who had pulled her out of an alley and brought her here, whose name was on an empire of organized crime, and who had read her 2019 paper 3 times. "What do you want from me?" she said. "Everything you saw in that painting," he said, "and everything you remember about how it was structured. And in return, the truth about your father," he said. "All of it. Whatever's in those columns." The river was moving fast below the window. Gerald was dead in a basement that smelled like old soup. The alarm had long since stopped screaming. "You're asking me to trust a Moretti," she said. "I'm asking you to trust the one who pulled you out of the alley," he said. She looked at her ruined painting, at the half-destroyed face of the unremarkable man in velvet who had been hiding something terrible in his robes for 12 years. She looked at Damien Moretti, and she made the worst and most necessary decision of her life. "Start with the lower register," she said. "Column 7. The sequencing breaks pattern at position 43, and that's not an error, that's a key." He sat down, opened a laptop. And outside, in the dark and the rain, the city of Chicago moved around them, enormous and indifferent, full of people who had no idea what had been found tonight or what it was going to cost. She didn't sleep. She sat at the long table while Damien's people moved around her in shifts. The compact woman, whose name turned out to be Carla, and 2 men she wasn't introduced to, who smelled like cigarettes and brought espresso in small cups at 2-hour intervals without being asked. The apartment ran on its own internal clock, a quiet machine that didn't stop for darkness or exhaustion or the particular human need to pretend the night had an end. Evelyn worked. She laid the photographs out in sequence on a secondary laptop Carla had provided, cross-referencing the columnar structures against her memory of the physical canvas. The thing about UV-revealed text was that the medium mattered as much as the message, the resin compound used, the application method, the drying pattern. Someone had taken extraordinary care with this. The strokes were fine enough to suggest a sable brush, size 0 or smaller, applied in controlled humidity. Whoever had hidden this ledger hadn't just understood encryption. They had understood paint. That bothered her in ways she couldn't fully articulate. By 3 in the morning, she had mapped the structural logic of the first 4 columns. The sequencing wasn't purely numerical. It alternated between base 12 and base 7 encoding at irregular intervals, which looked like noise until you understood that the intervals themselves were the key. Every time the base shifted, it marked a category change. Names to accounts, accounts to dates, dates to locations. She wrote this down on paper, not on the laptop. Old habit. Things written on paper could be burned. Things entered into a networked device had a way of persisting in places you couldn't reach. Damien had been on the phone for most of the night, in the next room, his voice low and controlled and occasionally going silent in the way that meant he was listening to something he didn't like. At 4:15, he came back into the main room and stood at the window with his hands in his pockets and looked at the river, which was lighter now, the pre-dawn gray getting into the water and making it look less dangerous than it probably was. "The men from the museum," he said. "They were Alderman Vasquez's people." Evelyn kept writing. "Who is Alderman Vasquez?" "Someone who sits on 3 city committees and takes a great deal of money from people who don't appear on any committee documents." He paused. "Also someone who appears in column 3 of your photographs." She looked up. "He sent men to destroy evidence of his own money laundering. He sent men to destroy a painting he didn't know anyone was looking at." Damien turned from the window. His face was tired in a way that didn't show in his expression so much as in the particular stillness of it, like a mask that had been worn too long and was starting to settle into the face beneath. Someone told him you were working on it. I've been working on it for 3 weeks. Yes. She put her pen down. Someone inside the museum. Someone with access to the conservation schedule. He moved to the table and looked at her notes without touching them, which is a short list. 3 people, she said. The department head, my assistant, and the registrar who processed the donation. She thought about each of them. Dr. Huang, who had been at the museum longer than she had and cared about nothing except his collection of pre-Columbian ceramics. Maya, her assistant, 26 years old and genuinely kind and deeply unremarkable in every way that mattered to the situation. And the registrar, a man named Price, who processed donations with the mechanical enthusiasm of someone who had long ago stopped seeing what he was processing. Which one? She said, not really asking. We don't know yet. But you have a preference. He looked at her. You have a preference, she said again. I can see it. His jaw did the thing, that small interior adjustment. The registrar processed the donation and assigned the conservation priority. He moved your timeline up by 3 weeks. Price, she said. The name felt different now. Ordinary syllable turned into something with weight. He told me the donor requested accelerated assessment. There was no such request in the donor documentation. She sat with that for a moment. Okay, she said, and picked up her pen, because there was nothing useful she could do with the information right now except file it in the part of her mind that was keeping score. They worked through the rest of the night in a kind of parallel silence, her with the photographs, him on the phone, Carla moving between them with the focused competence of a person who had long ago stopped being surprised by the hours bad situations kept. By 6 a.m, Evelyn had decoded enough of the ledger structure to understand that it was bigger than she'd thought. Not just financial records, not just names, a complete operational history. Routes, contacts, safe houses, enforcement personnel, and running through all of it like a river under ice, a second layer of encoding that she hadn't fully cracked yet, but whose structure suggested something older than the rest, something that predated the primary records by at least a decade. The painting had a painting inside it. The ledger had a ledger inside it. She was beginning to understand that everything connected to this case had that quality. Layers on layers, each one designed to protect something that was protecting something else. She fell asleep with her head on her arms at the table at 6:45 and woke up at 9 with a blanket over her shoulders that she didn't remember being there. Carla was gone. One of the unnamed men was at the kitchen counter making something that smelled like actual food. Damien was at the far end of the table, jacket off, working through printed documents with a pen. And for exactly 2 seconds before he noticed she was awake, she saw him without the weight of the performance he was always giving. Not threatening, not controlled, just exhausted and concentrated and human. Then he looked up and the performance came back on like a light. There's food, he said. I need a shower, she said. Carla left clothes, second door on the right. She stood up carefully, her body reporting multiple objections to the night she'd put it through. The canvas was still on the table where she'd left it, and she paused to check it out of instinct. The tear in the upper right hadn't worsened, which was something. Small professional mercy. The shower was hot, and she stood under it for longer than was strictly necessary, pressing her forehead against the cold tile and doing the inventory. Her father. 19 years. A federal case number hidden inside a Renaissance painting that someone had specifically moved up on her conservation schedule. A crime lord who had read her academic papers. A dead security guard in a museum basement. She turned the water off. She got dressed in the clothes Carla had left. Dark jeans, a gray sweater that fit well enough, flat boots that were almost her size. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror for approximately 3 seconds and then stopped because it wasn't helping. When she came back out, there was a man sitting at the table she hadn't seen before. He was younger than Damien by perhaps 10 years, with the same bone structure translated into something softer and more expressive, the kind of face that showed everything it was thinking without filtering it first. He was wearing a suit that was slightly too formal for 9 a.m. and had the look of someone who had been awake for a long time and was managing it through expensive coffee and sheer stubbornness. He looked up when Evelyn appeared and something moved across his face. surprise, and beneath it something more complicated. "You must be the conservator," he said. "You must be the brother," she said. He blinked, looked at Damien, who hadn't looked up from his documents. "Marco," Damien said. "Sit down." "I am sitting." "Then stop talking until I'm finished with this." Marco looked at Evelyn with the particular expression of a man who wanted to communicate that his brother was always like this, and he apologized on behalf of their entire bloodline. She sat down across from him and accepted the coffee one of the unnamed men brought her and drank it black because she wasn't in a position to be selective. "The wedding is in 36 hours, Marco said, to Damien, to the heir, to anyone who was listening. Damien turned a page. "There's a thing," Marco said, "a situation, with the Falcone family." Damien stopped turning pages. "Lucia's father," Marco continued carefully, in the way of someone who had learned through long experience which sentences to build slowly, wants confirmation that the Moretti side of the arrangement is still, he paused, choosing, consolidated. The arrangement is consolidated. He wants to see that, tonight, at the pre-reception. Marco leaned forward slightly. "Damien, he's bringing 8 people from Naples. This isn't social." Damien set his pen down, looked at his brother for the first time since Evelyn had come back into the room, and the look was complex and quick and contained about 6 different things she couldn't read. "The ledger," Evelyn said. Both men looked at her. "The Falcone name," she said. "Is it in the ledger?" Silence. "Column 4, she said. "The location strings. I haven't decoded all of them yet, but there's a recurring identifier that I read as a proper noun rather than a place designation. 7 characters, non-geographic distribution." She picked up her notes. "FALC something." Marco went very still. Damien's expression didn't change, which was worse. "How bad?" Evelyn said. "That depends," Damien said, "on what column 4 says about them." "Then let me finish decoding it before your future in-laws arrive," she said. Marco stood up, ran both hands through his hair, and said something in Italian that she didn't speak but understood by tone to be the verbal equivalent of a man looking down into a hole that was deeper than he'd thought. "The wedding can't be postponed," he said. There were negotiations, 2 years of negotiations. The wedding will not be postponed," Damien said. "Then what are we? We attend." Damien looked at Evelyn. "With appropriate coverage." She looked back at him, understood the word coverage with a particular sinking clarity. "No," she said. "You will be safest in a room full of people who don't know who you are." "A room full of your people." "A room full of everyone's people," he said, "which is considerably safer than being here alone while I'm managing the Falcone situation." "I'm not going to a wedding." "It's a pre-reception," Marco said, in the tone of someone offering a meaningful distinction that wasn't. "I don't have She gestured at herself, at the borrowed jeans and the almost right boots. "Carla will handle that. I am not an accessory to your—" "Ms. Mercer." Damien's voice was quiet. Exactly as quiet as it had been in the alley. "You decoded column 3 last night. You know what's in it. You know what they're protecting and what they will do to protect it. You are connected to this now, not by my choice and not by yours, by the choices of whoever framed your father." He paused. "I am not asking you to perform. I am asking you to be somewhere with walls and trained personnel until we understand what we are dealing with." The room was very quiet, except for the sound of traffic far below and the unnamed men trying to be invisible in the kitchen. Marco was looking at her with something that wasn't quite pity, but was adjacent to it. The expression of a man who understood that his brother had a way of presenting situations that left you standing in the place he needed you to stand without being entirely sure how you'd gotten there. She looked at her notes, at the partial decode of column 4, at the canvas on the table. "I want access to everything you have on the 1998 case," she said. "After the pre-reception. Before." Damien looked at her for 3 long seconds. "Before," he said. She picked up her pen. The file arrived within the hour. Physical documents, not digital, brought by a third man she hadn't seen before. Thick manila folders that smelled like a copy machine and storage. The particular smell of information that had been sitting somewhere dark for a long time. She read while Carla arrived and measured her for a dress with the professional detachment of a woman who had done far stranger things in this apartment and would not be mentioning any of them. The 1998 case was United States versus Mercer. The charges had been federal: racketeering, conspiracy, money laundering. The prosecution had presented bank records, wire transfer documentation, and testimony from two informants whose identities remained sealed. Her father had maintained his innocence throughout and had waived plea negotiations over the objections of his attorney. The jury had deliberated for 6 hours. The sentence was 22 years, of which he had served 19 before a procedural review. Not an exoneration, not yet, just a procedural review citing irregularities in the original evidence chain, had resulted in his release. She had been 19 when he was arrested. She was 34 now. She had not visited him in prison. She was not sure she could explain this without sounding like a worse person than she was, except to say that the visits had felt, after the first 2 years, like pressing on a wound that had learned to close around the pressure. She had written. He had written back. They had found a language for the space between them that was honest about its limitations. She had not visited him. She had not believed fully and completely that he was innocent. She closed the folder. Carla handed her a dress. Emerald green, structured, expensive in the way that didn't announce itself. Earrings. A small bag that weighed more than it should, and when she looked at it, Carla said, "Don't open that unless you need to," in the tone of someone providing information, not a warning. Evelyn didn't open it. The pre-reception was held at the Alderton House, a private event venue in River North that had been a bank in a previous life, and still had the bones of one. High coffered ceilings, marble floors, the particular acoustic quality of a space that had been designed to make important transactions feel even more important. It was full of people in expensive clothes, having conversations that were not about the things they were about. And Evelyn understood within 3 minutes of walking in that she was in a room full of professionals at something she had never trained for and could not name precisely, but which was its own kind of conservation work. The careful maintenance of surfaces so that what lay beneath them remained undisturbed. Damien wore black. She walked beside him and understood, from the way the room reorganized itself around their arrival, that she was visible in a way she had never been in her life, which was saying something because she had spent 15 years being specifically invisible. "Smile," he said, very quietly, not moving his lips. "I'm smiling," she said. "Less like you're working out a cipher." She adjusted her face. He steered her through the room with one hand at the small of her back that was light enough to be deniable but present enough to be a statement, and she felt the statement land with everyone who mattered and understood that she was being used as a communication device as much as she was a person, and she filed this resentment carefully in the same place she was filing everything else. Marco was there with a woman Evelyn assumed was Lucia Falcone, tall, dark-haired, with an expression of determined serenity that was either natural composure or an extraordinary performance of it. Beside Lucia stood an older man with the same jaw structure, heavier built, wearing a suit that was Italian in all the ways that Chicago suits weren't. This would be Matteo Falcone. He and Damien shook hands with the specific grip of two men taking each other's measure through their palms. "Moretti," he said. "Matteo," Damien said. "Your daughter is beautiful." "My daughter is practical," Matteo said, and smiled in a way that showed teeth without warmth. "It runs in the family." Evelyn stood beside Damien and smiled at the appropriate intervals and listened in the way she listened to paintings, not to what was being presented, but to the structure beneath it. Matteo Falcone asked 3 questions about the Moretti waterfront operations in the span of 6 minutes, each one phrased as casual curiosity, each one fishing for a specific piece of information. Damien answered each one with the elegant imprecision of a man who knew exactly what was being asked and had decided not to answer it. Something was wrong. She found it the way she found hidden damage in a varnish layer, not through a single revelation, but through accumulation. The caterer who was not moving like a caterer. The nervous frequency with which the bartender at the East Bar checked his phone. A man she recognized from the museum photographs. From the column 3 location strings, she was almost certain, though she couldn't be sure without her notes, standing near the fireplace with a glass of water he hadn't drunk, and the champagne. One of the waiters was working a circuit that didn't match the others. The other servers moved in a loose rotation, covering the room evenly. This one was targeting specific guests. Marco, twice. Damien, once, although Damien had declined without looking at the tray. Matteo Falcone, who had taken a glass but was holding it. She reached out and touched Damien's arm. Not urgently, just a hand on a forearm, the kind of contact a woman might make with a man she was with at a party. She felt the muscle beneath her palm go very slightly still. "The waiter," she said, keeping her voice at conversation level. "Gray vest. East side of the room." Damien's eyes moved in a way that was barely movement. "He's not rotating with the others," she said, "and the glasses on his tray have a different fill line, half a centimeter lower than the rest." A pause that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. "Marco," Damien said pleasantly, to his brother who was 3 feet away, "why don't you get us some of those things from the kitchen? The small bread things." Marco, who was clearly not a man accustomed to being sent for bread, looked at his brother for exactly 1 second and then said, "Of course," and moved away from the east bar. Evelyn watched the gray vest waiter track the movement, adjust his circuit. "He's following Marco," she said. Damien turned to her with the expression of a man having a delightful conversation at a party. His eyes were not having a delightful conversation. They were doing calculations. "When I move," he said very quietly, "stay with Carla. She's at the coat check." "I don't know which one is red scarf," he said. "She's had it on the whole time." He hadn't appeared to look at the coat check once since they'd arrived. "Damien," she said, and stopped. "What?" She wasn't sure what she had been going to say. A warning, maybe, or an objection, or the simple factual statement that she had been here for 40 minutes and was already in over her head, and the depth of the water was increasing in a way that she found both terrifying and, she would not admit this yet, clarifying. "The man by the fireplace," she said instead. "Water glass. He's been there since we arrived, and he's watching the Falcone group specifically, not the room." Damien's hand resting on the small of her back pressed very slightly. "I see him," he said. "Is he yours?" "No." "Is he Falcone's?" Pause. "No," he said, and the way he said it, the particular flatness of it, a word that meant something had just recategorized itself in his understanding, made the small hairs on her arms stand up beneath the emerald silk. He moved, smooth and unhurried, the way he moved through every room, as if the room had been arranged for him specifically and was only now fulfilling its purpose. She tracked him in her peripheral vision as he crossed toward Marco, leaned down to say something brief and quiet, and then redirected his path toward the gray vest waiter. What happened next lasted approximately 4 seconds. Damien intercepted the waiter near the east bar, appeared to stumble slightly. She would have called it a stumble if she hadn't been watching his feet, which didn't stumble, they placed, and the champagne tray tipped. 4 glasses went to the marble floor. The noise was sharp and total, and the room's attention snapped to it, the particular social gravity of broken glass pulling every eye except hers, which stayed on the man by the fireplace, who, in the 4 seconds of the crash, produced a phone and sent a text with the particular efficiency of someone completing a step in a sequence. She looked for Damien, found him crouching to help with the broken glass, murmuring something to a flustered-looking waiter who was not the gray vest waiter and was not flustered in the same way, and understood that whatever Damien had done in those 4 seconds, she'd seen only the visible surface of. Marco was beside her. She hadn't seen him cross the room. "We should find Lucia," he said quietly, "and perhaps move toward the back corridor." "What's in the back corridor?" "A car," he said. "Whose car?" "Ours," he said. "Which is why we should—" The lights went out. Full darkness, total, the room inhaling as one body. Someone screamed. A single voice, female, cut off by its own embarrassment. Emergency lighting activated along the floor trim, red-tinted and low, turning the marble and the beautiful clothes and the expensive faces into something that looked like the inside of a threat. Evelyn's hand found Marco's jacket without thinking. His hand found her arm. "Back corridor," he said. She moved with him because she had lost the ability to make better choices in the dark. They were halfway across the room when she heard the sound she'd heard in the museum basement. Pneumatic, suppressed, professional. And something hit the marble pillar beside them, and Marco said a word in Italian that definitely didn't require translation, and they were running now, the emergency lights turning everything to red blur, and she lost Marco's arm. She stopped. Turned. He was behind her, but there were other people between them, the crowd reorganizing in the dark into something panicked and directionless, and she couldn't see Carla, couldn't see the red scarf, couldn't see Damien, couldn't see anything except red-lit faces that all looked the same. A hand closed on her wrist. Not Marco's hand. Different grip, harder, pulling with directional certainty. She pulled back. "Stop pulling," said Damien's voice. She stopped pulling. He moved her through the crowd with the hand on her wrist, navigating by something that wasn't sight, some internal map of the space he must have built the moment they walked in, and she thought, he memorized the exits. He walked in here, and the first thing he did was map every way out. She filed this thought in the place where she was keeping things about him that she hadn't decided what to do with yet. The back corridor was a maintenance hallway, concrete and fluorescent, and the lights in here still worked. A car waited at the loading dock exit, engine running, Carla in the front passenger seat, and an unfamiliar driver who moved the car the moment the door closed. Marco got in from the other side. His jacket was torn at the shoulder. He was breathing like a man who had just discovered the specific horror of a situation he'd been told might happen. "Lucia," he said. "She was moved at the first sign of trouble," Damien said. "She's already in the second vehicle." "The man by the fireplace." "Identified." "Who is he?" Silence from the front seat area, though Damien was in the back. Not a directional silence. The silence in the car lasted exactly as long as it took to get 4 blocks from the Alderton house. Then Damien said, "Salvatore!" And the word landed in the vehicle like something dropped from a height. Marco turned to look at his brother, the torn jacket, the emergency light pallor still sitting in his face. "What?" "The man by the fireplace." Damien was looking straight ahead through the windshield at the wet Chicago street, his hands on his knees, very still. "He works for Salvatore." The name meant nothing to Evelyn yet, except that it had done something to Marco's face that she hadn't seen anything do to Marco's face before. Not the gunshot in the dark, not the crowd panic, not the crash of the champagne glasses. This did it. His expression didn't collapse exactly. It drained, like watching color leave a thing. "That's not possible," Marco said. "I recognized him," Damien said. 3 years ago. Salvatore's operation in the South Warehouse. He was on security." "That doesn't mean Salvatore." "A man doesn't walk into my brother's pre-wedding reception running surveillance without the knowledge of the person who employs him." Damien's voice was flat and even, and had the quality of something being read from a surface where it had been written a long time ago. "He knew we'd be there. He knew the room. He texted someone the moment the lights went out." Marco looked out his window at the streets passing. He pressed 2 fingers to his mouth briefly, a gesture so private it seemed wrong to watch. "Salvatore raised us," he said. "Yes." "After the parents died, he was the one who—" "I know what he was," Damien said. The car turned. The driver was taking a route Evelyn didn't recognize, doubling through the warehouse district the way people did when they wanted to see who was following and make it inconvenient. She sat between the 2 brothers in the back seat and felt the particular quality of being present inside a grief that wasn't hers and didn't have room for her and was happening anyway. She said nothing. For once in her life, she had nothing she needed to say. They went to a different location than the West Loop apartment, a building farther south, older, a converted printing facility with the ghost of industrial ink in the concrete walls. Carla went ahead and had the space operational by the time they arrived. Laptops, a secure line, food that nobody touched. 2 additional men Evelyn hadn't met were already there, both of them with the specific bearing of people who were waiting to be told what to do next, and were comfortable waiting because they had been comfortable waiting for a long time. Damien stood at the center table and looked at the photographs from Evelyn's phone, which Carla had transferred to a secured tablet. His face was closed in a way it hadn't been before. Not controlled, exactly. Sealed, like something that had been closed and then had the seam pressed down flat. "Show me column 4, he said to Evelyn. She pulled up her notes. spread the decoded sequences across the table in the order she'd worked them out. The Falcone identifier appears 9 times, she said, but it's not financial. It's not in the accounts tier. It's in the location strings, and the dates associated with it run from 2009 to 2014, which is earlier than the other location data by at least 3 years. Damien looked at the sequence without touching it. 2009, he said quietly to himself. What happened in 2009, she said. Marco had sat down in a chair near the wall and had not moved from it since they'd arrived. He was looking at the floor between his feet with an expression she couldn't categorize except to say that it was the expression of a man in the process of recalculating something enormous and finding that the new number didn't work. 2009 was when our father died, Damien said. When Salvatore took over transitional management of the family's operations, temporarily. He paused. He was still in temporary management the day I turned 28 and formally took the name. He managed it for 9 years, Evelyn said. He managed it for 9 years, Damien said. She looked at the sequences, at the Falcone identifier appearing 9 times across a 5-year period in the location tier. He was building a relationship with the Falcones independently, before you were aware of it, before Marco's engagement. He was building a relationship with the Falcones, Damien said, without me, which means the alliance you're looking at in column 4 was not a Moretti-Falcone arrangement. He pressed one finger to the table beside the sequence. It was a De Luca-Falcone arrangement, operating under the Moretti name, without Moretti authorization. The room was very quiet. Salvatore introduced the Falcones to Marco, Marco said from his chair. His voice was flat and careful. He said he'd known Matteo for years. He said the connection was good for the family. He said Lucia was... He stopped. He arranged the introduction. 2 years ago. He told me it was a fortunate coincidence. It was not a coincidence, Damien said. Marco looked up. He arranged my wedding. He arranged an alliance, Damien said. Your wedding was the mechanism. Something moved across Marco's face that wasn't grief anymore. It was harder than grief, less patient. And Matteo knew this? Lucia's father knew he was being arranged, or did Salvatore? We don't know yet what Matteo knew, Damien said. We don't know the terms. We don't know what Salvatore offered him or what he asked in return. Lucia didn't know, Marco said. Not a question. The fierceness of it was protective and immediate and raw. I don't believe Lucia knew anything, Damien said, and it was the gentlest thing Evelyn had heard him say, which wasn't very gentle but was sufficient for the moment. She was still looking at her notes, at column 4 and its 9 identifiers and its 5-year span. At the older encoding layer she'd identified before the reception, the one that predated the primary records by a decade. She picked up her pen. There's a second layer, she said. I mentioned it this morning, the older encoding. I hadn't fully mapped it yet, but I know its structure is different from the primary records. It uses a different base interval, and it's... She traced through her notes. It runs from approximately 1996 to 2000. The room's quality of silence changed. 1996 to 2000, Damien said. Yes. The case file you gave me, she said, without looking up. The federal case. The charges against my father. The original evidence was submitted in 1998. She heard Damien sit down. An unusual sound because he moved without announcing himself as a rule. But this was the sound of a man sitting down in a specific way, the way people sat when they needed to be closer to the ground. The bank records in the prosecution file, she said. The wire transfer documentation. They would have had routing information, account identifiers. Yes. I need to see them. Evelyn, I need to see the actual records, she said, and now she looked up. Not the summary, not the legal brief, the underlying financial documentation. Because if the secondary encoding layer in this ledger is structured the way I think it is, it's not just a record. It's a source document. It's where the evidence came from. She held his gaze. Someone took real transaction data, real account sequences, and they rebuilt them into a false context. They made real numbers point at the wrong man. Damien was looking at her with something she hadn't seen in his face before. It took her a moment to identify it. Recognition, not of information, of experience. The specific expression of someone who has just heard a thing described that they have felt but not been able to name. "Call Renata," he said to Carla. "Tell her I need the Mercer prosecution documentation, the original evidence package. Tonight." Carla moved. Marco stood up from his chair. "I want to know about the shooting," he said. "In the reception. Who authorized—" "We're getting to that." "We're getting to it now," Marco said. The softness was gone from his voice entirely. What was underneath it was less refined and more honest. "Someone tried to put a bullet in me at my own pre-wedding event, Damien. That's not something I'm willing to table." "The waiter was not trying to kill you," Damien said. "The poisoned champagne was intended to incapacitate. Put you in a hospital, delay the wedding by a minimum of 2 weeks. To what end?" "To give Salvatore time to renegotiate the terms of whatever arrangement he has with Matteo Falcone without you present to complicate it." Damien looked at his brother steadily. "You are the arrangement, Marco. You are the mechanism."
"If you're incapacitated, Salvatore controls the timeline." The sound Marco made was very short and not repeated. He turned and put one hand flat on the wall and stayed like that for approximately 5 seconds. "I want to talk to Salvatore," he said. "No. He's like a father to us, Damien. I want to hear it from him. I want to look at him. And what?" Damien said. "What do you think he's going to say?" "I want to know if he knew what the waiter was going to do. I want to know if he's capable." "He hid financial records inside a painting in a public museum," Damien said. "He arranged your engagement as a financial instrument. He had a man running surveillance on us tonight." He paused. "He is capable." Marco's hand pressed harder against the wall. His shoulders were up around his ears. He was 34 years old, and he was standing with his hand against a wall in an industrial building in the south of Chicago, and the shape of his life as he had understood it was undergoing a revision so large it didn't have a name yet. Evelyn looked away, gave him the privacy of her attention somewhere else. She looked at the canvas. Carla had brought it from the West Loop apartment, and it was here on a side table, still rolled, still damaged at the upper right corner. She thought about the man in dark velvet and his unremarkable face and the 19 years her father had spent inside a federal correctional facility, believing, or trying to believe, that someone would eventually see through what had been done to him. She hadn't visited after the 2nd year. She pressed the pen point into the paper in front of her. Not writing, just pressure. The prosecution documents arrived at 11:17 that night, delivered by a woman named Renata, who was small and sharp-eyed, and who looked at Evelyn with the assessing gaze of someone who was reserving judgment but had already formed an opinion. She handed the package to Damien without ceremony and left without staying. Evelyn opened the package. The original financial documentation was 43 pages. She went through it with the UV lamp she'd asked Carla to source, a portable unit, not as powerful as the museum's, but adequate. The account sequences in the prosecution evidence were clean on UV, no hidden encoding. They were straightforward banking records, which meant the manipulation had happened upstream, before they became evidence. Whoever had built the case against her father had not falsified the bank records themselves. They had falsified the transactions that generated the records. Real accounts, real routing numbers, real transaction trails, just not Arthur Mercer's. "The accounts are real," she said. She was sitting on the floor because the table was covered in her notes, and she'd run out of horizontal surface. "The transactions are real, but the name attached to them, the beneficial owner designation, that's where the falsification happened. Someone substituted my father's personal identifier into accounts he'd never opened and transactions he'd never made." Damien was on the floor on the other side of the table, his back against the cabinet, his jacket gone, his sleeves rolled to the elbow. He had the secondary encoding sequences from the ledger in front of him on a printed sheet. "The secondary layer," he said, "the 1996 to 2000 records. I think you're right about what they are." He slid the sheet across the floor to her. "Look at position 12 in the first column, that account sequence." She looked again. Picked up the prosecution documentation, found page 9. The primary account in the federal case. United States versus Mercer, account identifier beginning with the sequence 774. The ledger's secondary layer, Position 12. First column, 774. The same account. In both documents. This is it, she said. Her voice sounded strange to her. This is the source record. This is where the evidence came from. Whoever built the case against my father took real transaction data from, she traced the sequence, from a genuine account in this ledger and substituted his identification details. They kept the financial trail intact because a fabricated trail could be disproven. They just changed the name at the end of it. And who owns account 774 in the ledger? Damien said. She looked at the column designation, at the name encoding in the primary tier above it. At the base 12 sequence she decoded 6 hours ago that she hadn't yet attached to an identity because she'd been working on structural logic first and hadn't gotten to the name tier in that column. She decoded it now. It took 4 minutes. Her hands were very steady, and her mind was a clear, cold, furious thing operating at a frequency she didn't normally have access to. The name decoded to 11 characters, Italian construction. She wrote the letters out in order, and then she read what she had written, and she put the pen down, and she sat very still on the floor of the printing facility and felt the particular weight of a truth that had been waiting 19 years to be carried by someone. She turned the paper around and pushed it across the floor to Damien. He looked at it. She watched him read it. She watched the stillness happen. Not gradual, immediate, total. Like a temperature drop. Like something had passed through him from the outside and left ice in all the places it touched. Salvatore De Luca. The account that had destroyed her father. The money that had looked like racketeering. The financial trail that had convinced a jury in 6 hours that Arthur Mercer was a criminal. It had all originated from a Moretti Circle account registered in the name of the man who had raised Damien Moretti after his parents died. The man who had managed the family's empire for 9 years before Damien took the name. The man who had been like a father, who had been building something in the shadow of the Moretti name for 20 years and using innocent people to protect it. Damien set the paper down. He did not move for a long time. Then he said very quietly, "How many others?" She understood the question. "I don't know yet. The secondary layer has multiple account sequences. If they were all used the same way, if every account represents someone who was—" "How many?" he said. "At least 6, she said. "Possibly more. The ones I can identify from the prosecution file format. There could be others I don't have reference documentation for." Damien stood up. It was not a fast movement. It was the movement of something very large and very heavy deciding to be vertical. He walked to the window and stood there, and she could see from where she was on the floor the reflection of his face in the dark glass. And what she saw in that reflection was not the controlled, precise, economical man who had stood in a rain-soaked alley with a black umbrella and told her to get in the car. What she saw was someone who had been hit in a place they'd believed was protected. Marco appeared in this doorway from the adjacent room. He had heard enough. She could see it in the way he was standing, the particular quality of stillness that was not peace but its opposite, anger that had compressed itself into something that could be carried. "Say it out loud," Marco said. Damien didn't turn from the window. "Say it out loud, Damien. I need to hear you say it." A pause that lasted a long time and was doing a lot of work. "Salvatore framed at least 6 people for crimes committed by his own operation," Damien said. "He used the Moretti name and Moretti infrastructure to build an empire within the empire, and he protected it by feeding innocent people to the federal system." He turned from the window. "That is what I'm saying." Marco sat down on the floor. Not a decision. His legs simply stopped operating in the way legs needed to operate, and he was on the floor. And Evelyn watched this happen and thought about the particular violence of learning that the architecture of your life was built on someone else's crime. She had learned it at 19. She recognized the posture. It was 4 a.m. Outside, Chicago continued at its overnight pace, the city doing the things cities did when most of their inhabitants were unconscious and the rest were making decisions they would live with in daylight. Carla brought coffee that nobody asked for. The unnamed men had taken up positions that suggested they were waiting for an escalation and expected it to come soon. Evelyn got up off the floor. Her back ached and her eyes felt like they'd been scoured with the turpentine she'd been smelling for 12 professional years. She rolled the prosecution documents carefully and set them beside the canvas on the side table. Evidence beside evidence,
2 artifacts of the same crime separated by 19 years. The shipping terminal, she said. Damien looked at her. The ledger has location strings in column 4, she said. I decoded 8 of the 9 Falcone identifiers. The 9th one, the most recent, dated 4 months ago, points to a specific location, an address on the industrial waterfront, south of the river. She went to her notes and found the page. I think it's where whatever they're importing is being held. Importing, Damien said. The ledger is a running record, she said. It doesn't stop at 2014 when the Falcone strings end in the main tier. There's a 3rd tier I haven't mentioned yet because I wanted to decode the other 2 first. She turned a page. It starts 2 years ago, and it's different from the others. Denser, more current. It looks like an active operations log. And it has incoming shipment designations that I can't identify from the account context alone. I need to know what's being shipped to know what the entries mean. Damien came to look at the notes. He stood close enough that she could smell the night on him. Cold air, and something that might have been the same cordite she'd noticed in the car the first night, or might have been the memory of it overlaid on everything else. You want to go to the terminal, he said. I want to know what's in the terminal, she said. There's a difference. The corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile. The shadow of one, moving through and gone. We go at dawn, he said. Why dawn? Because security patterns on industrial facilities shift at shift change, and shift change on the waterfront is 6:30 in the morning, and a 4-minute window exists between the outgoing patrol's sign-off and the incoming patrol's first sweep. He looked at the notes. Also because we need 2 hours to prepare, and it is currently 4 in the morning. She looked at him, at the precision of it, at the way he carried operational knowledge, the way she carried conservation knowledge. Not as information he'd memorized, but as something his body understood through long practice. You've been watching that terminal, she said. I've been watching a lot of things, he said. How long? Long enough? She wanted to push on this, but the timeline was tightening and she had a 3rd tier of encoding to finish before 6, and she could feel the hours burning off at a rate that left no margin. She sat back down with her notes. At 5:40, she finished the 3rd tier. She sat with what it told her for approximately 2 minutes before she said anything. Damien. He came from across the room. She turned the notebook toward him. The 3rd tier entries in her decoded notation listed incoming shipment designations, dates, and values. She had been expecting mercenaries based on what he'd said the night before. She had been expecting weapons, or cash, or contraband product. The values were too high for any of those. The shipment designations were too specific. She pointed to the format code on the first entry. Do you know what this is? He looked again. That's a TICO registration code, he said slowly. It's an artifact transport registration, she said. International standard. I know that format because I've processed dozens of legitimate ones through the museum. The code indicates country of origin, classification category, and declared value. She moved her finger along the entry. This one came from Turkey. It's classified as non-monetized cultural property, and the declared value is $47 million, he said. The declared value, which means the actual market value is probably 3 to 4 times that. She looked at the full list, 11 entries over 14 months. This isn't a weapons shipment, she said. They've been importing stolen antiquities, looted artifacts, probably from active conflict zones, being brought into Chicago through the Falcone shipping network and stored on the waterfront. She tapped the final entry. The most recent one came in 8 days ago. Damien was reading down the list with the specific focus of a man reconfiguring everything he thought he'd been working toward. The value, he said. Conservative estimate across all 11 shipments, she said. $350 million. Maybe more depending on what's in the most recent. That's not import inventory, he said. That's a fund. That's a war chest. He looked at her. Someone's been liquidating the Moretti Empire's legitimate assets and replacing them with stolen cultural property that can't be traced through standard financial channels, moving the Empire's real wealth into something that doesn't appear on any balance sheet, and using it to fund a takeover, he said, a complete structural replacement. Every legitimate front the Moretti name touches
replaced with something Salvatore controls directly, financed through an asset pool the size of a small nation's GDP. He stepped back from the table. He's not building within the empire. He's building a replacement for it. The words in the room, the weight of them, the specific horror of the architecture becoming clear. Not a betrayal committed in anger or desperation or even greed alone, but a betrayal committed with the patience and precision of a man who thought in decades. Salvatore De Luca, who had raised them, who had been there at every important moment of their lives for 30 years, who had managed everything in the transition years with such apparent selflessness that no one had thought to look at what his hands were doing while everyone else watched his face. Carla appeared. She had her phone pressed to her chest, and her expression was the expression she made when the information she was carrying required a specific kind of delivery. "There's a problem," she said. "What kind?" Damien said. "Salvatore called the main line 40 minutes ago, before we got here. He left a message." She held out the phone. "He knows about the painting. He knows Evelyn decoded the ledger. He knows you're looking at the terminal." The room changed temperature. "He has a source inside this operation," Marco said from the floor. His voice was very flat. "Someone here. Someone with us." Nobody looked at anybody. The particular agony of that, of being in a room with people you'd trusted and understanding that one of them was not what they appeared. "The message," Damien said to Carla. "What did he say?" Carla hesitated for exactly 1 second, which was uncharacteristic of her. "He said you have until tomorrow morning to return the painting and the documentation," she said. "Or he'll implement what he called the contingency arrangement." She paused. "He said you'll know what that means." Damien's face went through something fast and total, and then it was sealed again. "What does it mean?" Evelyn said. Damien turned and looked at his brother. Marco understood before she did. She could see it cross his face. The arrival of a specific horror, personal and targeted, the kind that found the most vulnerable thing and pressed there. "Lucia," Marco said. "She's being held," Damien said. "As of approximately 2 hours ago, I think, while we were driving here. The second vehicle." He pressed 2 fingers to the table. Salvatore's people were in the second vehicle. Marco was on his feet before the sentence ended. "Marco, he has Lucia, Damien." "I know." "She has nothing to do with—" "I know," Damien said, louder now, not sharp but forceful, the kind of force that didn't shout because it didn't need to. "I know she has nothing to do with this. Salvatore knows that too. That's why he took her." Marco's chest was heaving. His fists were at his sides. He was a man who had spent his adult life in the diplomatic middle distance between his brother's world and a version of himself that could bring someone like Lucia Falcone into it safely, and that distance had just collapsed to 0. "We give him back the painting," Marco said. "No," Damien said. "We give him the painting and he gives us Lucia and we—" "He will not give us Lucia," Damien said. "He will take the painting and use the 3 days of advantage it gives him to finish the structural transfer. And then Lucia becomes a permanent piece of leverage. That's not a trade. That's a surrender." "Then what do we do?" Marco said, and his voice cracked, barely, on the last word. "Not much. Just enough to reveal that underneath the Moretti name and the Italian suits and the 10 years of learning how to occupy a room the way dangerous men occupied rooms, he was still someone's younger brother. Still the softer one. Still the one who had wanted something good and thought he'd found it." Evelyn looked at her decoded notes. At the terminal address in column 4. At the $350 million war chest sitting on the Chicago waterfront. At the painting that had started everything, damaged in its upper corner, resting on a side table in a printing facility at 5:50 in the morning. She had spent her professional life understanding what had been hidden and why, what preservation required, what could be recovered from damage, and what could not. "We go to the terminal," she said. "We go now, before he expects us to, and we get the proof we need to destroy his leverage entirely. Not the paintings, not the ledger, the physical evidence, the actual stolen artifacts with their registration codes." She looked at Damien. "You can't leverage a man who has nothing left to protect." Damien looked at her for a moment that had several layers to it. "You understand what we'll find there," he said. "What walking into that place means in terms of—"
I understand that my father spent 19 years in federal prison for a crime committed by the man who gave that evidence to the prosecution, she said. And I understand that there are 5 other people in those ledger entries who got the same deal he did, and that Salvatore De Luca is currently holding a woman hostage who has never done anything except agree to marry into a family she didn't fully understand.
She picked up the canvas from the side table and held it. I also understand that whoever hid this ledger in this painting built it with archival logic. They wanted it to be found by the right person, eventually. They wanted a record that would survive them. She looked at Damien. Someone on your side knew about this, she said. Someone built the evidence trail and hid it where they hoped it would be found. That person is not Salvatore. That means there's someone else in this, someone who's been waiting for this to break open. The room was fully silent. Who else knew about the painting, she said. Who else had access to the donation process? Who else could have put it in that museum and moved up the conservation timeline and positioned it so that specifically an Arthur Mercer's daughter, would be the one to open it under UV light? Damien's expression was already somewhere past where she was. He'd gotten there faster. She could see it. Someone arranged for you to find it, he said. Not a question. Someone arranged for me to find it, she said. This was not an accident. I was chosen. The dawn light was starting at the edges of the warehouse windows, gray and cold and indifferent. The lake light that came off Lake Michigan and didn't warm anything, just illuminated it. We need to move, Damien said. He picked up his jacket, looked at Evelyn with an expression she didn't have a category for yet, but which she would remember later as the moment when the professional calculation between them crossed into something that didn't have a professional name. Stay close, he said, and if I tell you to get down, you get down. No argument. No, the terminal sat at the end of a service road that didn't appear on standard navigation maps, behind a chain-link perimeter that had been upgraded sometime in the last 18 months. New posts, new razor wire, new cameras mounted at intervals that suggested someone had paid attention to their placement. Damien noticed the cameras first. Evelyn noticed that 3 of the 4 visible ones had their indicator lights off, which meant either they were dummy units or they were running on a separate power system that didn't advertise itself. Dummy units don't get mounted on upgraded posts, she said. No, Damien said. They don't. They were in a nondescript panel van 200 meters from the perimeter, Carla in the driver's seat with the engine off, everyone breathing at the volume of people who had agreed without discussing it to take up as little space as possible. Marco was in the back with 2 of the men. The named ones, she'd learned their names in the last hour, Beto and Sal, and she'd noted without commenting that Sal was not short for Salvatore, and nobody in this vehicle was in a position to find that funny. Dawn was coming in hard off the lake. The sky above the waterfront was doing its gray to copper transition. The industrial cranes along the terminal silhouetted against it like enormous birds that had decided to stop mid-motion and stay that way forever. The air smelled like diesel and cold water, and the particular mineral smell of Chicago in early spring when the ice was almost gone, but not quite. 6:20, Carla said. 4 minutes. Damien had his eyes on the terminal gate. The outgoing patrol, 2 men, vehicle, standard sweep, had passed their position 12 minutes ago heading south. The incoming patrol would come from the north access road, 4 minutes between them. Maybe 4.5 if the incoming team stopped for coffee, which Damien had said they sometimes did based on 2 weeks of observation he'd done from a position she didn't ask about. What's the internal layout? She said. 3 warehouse structures, he said. A, B, and C from north to south. The active import codes in the ledger use a 2-digit suffix that matches standard Chicago port warehouse designations. The most recent shipment, 8 days ago, came in under a B suffix. Warehouse B, center of the facility, which is the farthest from any exit. Yes, she absorbed this. And Salvatore's people, inside. Minimum 4, possibly 8. We don't know if he's been here since last night or if he's managing remotely. Damien checked his watch, not a phone, an actual watch, mechanical, the kind that didn't need a signal. 2 minutes. Marco's voice came from the back. We get the documentation and we get out. That's the objective. That's the objective, Damien confirmed. Not a confrontation. Not unless it becomes one. Damien, Marco. Quiet, final. We get what we came for. She felt the van settle around the silence. 1 minute. 30 seconds. Carla started the engine at 15 seconds, the sound of it swallowed by the ambient noise of the waterfront. A freight train moving parallel to them 300 meters east, a tugboat working somewhere on the river, the structural groaning of the cranes in the morning wind. The gate was padlocked. Beto was out of the van before it fully stopped, had the lock addressed in under 8 seconds with a tool that made no sound, and was back in motion toward the perimeter by the time Damien and Evelyn were through the gap. Carla took the van to a position behind the northernmost structure. Marco and Sal went right, toward the fence line. Damien and Evelyn went straight, toward Warehouse B. She had spent her professional life being careful with things, moving slowly, thinking before she touched. The sprint across 60 meters of open concrete in the gray dawn with the cold lake wind hitting her face, and her footsteps too loud in her own ears was the most direct violation of every professional instinct she possessed. And she ran it without hesitating because the alternative was standing still, and she had passed the point where standing still was an option. They reached the warehouse wall, pressed against it, breathing. Damien looked at her. She nodded. They moved along the wall to the side entrance, a personnel door beside the vehicle bay which was locked with a keypad. He looked at it. Looked at her. She didn't know why he was looking at her until he tilted his head at the keypad with a slight expression of inquiry, and she understood that he was asking if she had anything. I'm an art conservator, she whispered. You decoded a double-encrypted Renaissance ledger in 6 hours. That's not the same skill set. He looked back at the keypad. Then he pressed 4 digits, and the lock clicked open. She stared at him. It's the same code as the original perimeter lock, he said. Salvatore's people are not creative with numbers. The interior of Warehouse B was cold and vast and smelled like the same mineral water smell as outside, but concentrated. The smell of large things that had been stored in an enclosed space for a while. High windows let in the copper dawn light in columns that fell across the floor and illuminated a lot of dust and the specific organized chaos of a facility that was actively in use. Crates, pallets, a forklift parked near the central bay, and against the south wall, stacked on climate-controlled shelving units that were absolutely not standard port equipment, a series of sealed transit cases with TICO registration labels attached to the locking mechanisms. She counted 11 cases immediately, possibly more behind the shelving. That's them, she said. Her voice came out very low. The cases were approximately 1 meter by 1.5 meters, the kind used for international museum transport. She had processed dozens of them. She knew the labeling standard intimately. She crossed to the nearest one and looked at the registration label without touching the case. Turkey. Non-monetized cultural property. Declared value $4.7 million. The registration code matched exactly what she'd decoded from the ledger. This is it, she said. These are the artifacts, all of them. She turned to Damien. I need to photograph the registration labels, all of them. With the cases visible in the frame, the documentation needs to show physical possession, not just paperwork. He handed her a phone without being asked. She didn't wonder when he'd decided to have one ready. She moved along the shelving, photographing systematically. Label, case, label, case. The trained speed of someone who had spent 15 years documenting things under time pressure in temperature-sensitive environments. Her hands were completely steady, which surprised her and then stopped surprising her because she understood that this was what 12 years of restoration work had actually trained her for. Not steadiness and comfort, but steadiness when the object mattered and the time was wrong and the conditions were bad. She was on the 7th case when she heard the door. Not the personnel door they'd come through. The vehicle bay door rolling up from outside, the mechanical sound of it enormous in the metal space. Damien had heard it before she did. He was already moving toward her, positioning between her and the door, his right hand at the back of his jacket, where she now understood something lived that she hadn't asked about. The vehicle bay opened onto headlights. An SUV pulling in, engine cutting, 4 doors opening. Then a 5th door, which was not an SUV door. A separate vehicle she hadn't seen coming through the bay behind the first, and then the interior lights of the warehouse came on. Full, industrial, overhead fluorescence that turned everything flat and certain and left nowhere to be that wasn't visible. There were 6 of them, not 4. And standing between the 2 vehicles with his coat buttoned despite the early hour and his hands loose at his sides in the way of a man who had never needed to look like he was about to do something to be doing it, was a man she had not met but recognized immediately and entirely from the particular quality of the attention the room paid him. Salvatore De Luca was 71 years old and looked 60, and the 60 he looked was the kind of 60 built from a life lived at high operational intensity. Compact, precise, with eyes that moved through a room the way quality lenses moved through a scene, gathering light and information without reflecting anything back. His hair was white. His jaw was still strong. He looked like the kind of man who had been someone's surrogate father and had done it, externally, with great conviction. He looked at Damien. "You came faster than I expected," he said. His accent was thicker than Damien's, more Italian, less worn away. "I told Carla not until 7. The sentence landed. Evelyn watched it land on Damien's face and saw the very small and total reordering that happened there. Not shock, because Damien Moretti had probably shock-proofed himself against most things a long time ago, but the specific recalibration of a man who has just had a confirmed theory stop being a theory. "Carla," Damien said. "Not a question. A full stop." "She's been with me for 3 years," Salvatore said, "since before you brought her in. That's the thing about loyalty, Damien. It runs in the direction of the person who earned it first." Evelyn thought about Carla's hands. Competent, efficient hands that had brought her clothes and coffee and a portable UV lamp without being asked. Hands that had known exactly what she needed because they'd been watching what she did and reporting it. Damien's breathing had not changed. She was standing close enough to him to know. "Where's Lucia?" Damien said. "Comfortable," Salvatore said. "The Falcone girl is perfectly comfortable. She'll stay that way as long as this conversation goes the direction it should go." He looked at the shelving behind them, at the transit cases. "You've been photographing my inventory." "It's not your inventory," Evelyn said. Salvatore looked at her. It was the first time he'd looked directly at her, and the quality of it was the quality of a man who had spent 71 years deciding what was worth his full attention. She was apparently worth a fraction of it. "The conservator," he said, "Arthur Mercer's daughter." He said her father's name the same way Damien had said it that first night, with the particular weight of a past tense applied to someone still living. "Your father was a useful story," he said. "I'm sorry it cost him what it did, but the alternative was considerably worse for a considerably larger number of people." The breath she took was even. She made it even. "You destroyed his life," she said. "I protected an operation that employed 400 people and funded charitable foundations in 3 states," he said. The calculus was not complicated. "He spent 19 years. Many people spend 19 years in difficult circumstances," Salvatore said. "That is the nature of the world. I did not invent the calculus. I applied it." He looked back at Damien. "The painting. The documentation on the girl's phone. I need both." "The photographs are already transmitted," Damien said. It was a lie. Evelyn's phone had no signal inside the warehouse. She'd checked the moment the lights came on. But it was said with the specific weight of a man stating a fact, and she understood immediately that she should not look at her phone. Salvatore looked at Damien for a long moment. "Then we have a more serious problem," he said. "We always had a more serious problem," Damien said. "You built it." Salvatore walked forward 2 steps. His 6 men did not move. They were positioned at angles that were not accidental, covering the personnel door, the vehicle bay, the space between the shelving and the center of the floor. Someone had taught them how to stand in a room. "I built this family," Salvatore said, and for the first time something moved in his voice that wasn't operational. Not grief exactly, not guilt, something older and harder than either. "Before your father died. Before you were old enough to understand what the name cost. I built the structures that allowed you to inherit something worth inheriting instead of a burning house." He stopped 8 feet from Damien. "Everything you've spent the last 12 years running, I kept intact for you." while running a parallel operation that stripped its legitimate assets and replaced them with stolen cultural property, Damien said, while securing the family's long-term position in a way that your particular ethical architecture wouldn't have permitted had I brought it to you directly. So you didn't ask. I knew the answer. Then you knew I would find out eventually. Salvatore looked at him with something that might, in another context, have resembled the complex fondness of a man for someone he'd raised. I thought you'd find out after I was dead, he said, and that by then the transition would be complete, and the family would be in a stronger position, and you would spend perhaps 6 months angry at a man who was no longer available to be angry at. He paused. I did not account for the painting. Who hit it? Damien said. A shift in Salvatore's expression. Subtle. The first genuine tell she'd seen from him. What? The painting, Damien said. The ledger inside it. Someone built that evidence trail and hid it in a public institution where it would survive indefinitely. Someone built it to be found. Not by you, and not by me. By someone specific. He paused. Who? Salvatore's jaw set. The tell had closed again. That is not a conversation we're having here. Then we're not having any conversation, Damien said. Give me Lucia, and I walk away from this building with what I came for. You walk away from this building with what I came for, Salvatore said, or Marco's future wife has a very different next few days. The silence was physical. She could feel it pressing against her eardrums. Then the personnel door opened and Marco came through it, and Damien said, Marco, stop. And Marco didn't stop. He crossed the floor at a speed that erased any of the diplomatic middle distance he'd been maintaining his entire adult life. And he went directly to Salvatore and stopped 2 feet from him and looked at the man who had been at his birthday celebrations and his school graduations, and the moment he'd told the family he wanted something different than what the family usually offered, and Marco said very quietly, Where is she? Salvatore looked at Marco with the expression of a man who had prepared for many versions of this moment and was now in a version he hadn't fully prepared for, because Marco's face contained something that the operational calculations hadn't accounted for. Not rage, not grief, but a specific and total and very simple love that made the leverage being applied to it visible in a way that made the mechanics of it ugly even to the man applying them. She's safe, Marco, Salvatore said. She will stay safe. You used my engagement, Marco said. You used 2 years of my life and Lucia's life as a financial instrument. You arranged it. I facilitated. You arranged it, Marco said. You looked at me and you saw a useful mechanism. His voice was not breaking. It was doing something harder than breaking. It was holding completely steady in a way that took more force than breaking. I came to you when I met her. I was 20 minutes out of that first dinner, and I called you because I wanted to tell someone, and I called you. That's who I called. Salvatore said nothing. And you already knew who she was, Marco said. You already had the arrangement in place, and you let me talk. His jaw moved. You let me tell you what she was like. The warehouse was completely still. Salvatore De Luca, who had survived 7 decades in a world that ate lesser men for operational efficiency, looked at the younger Moretti brother and experienced something that Evelyn, watching from 6 feet away, could not name precisely, but could observe in the specific quality of his stillness. The stillness of a man confronting the collateral damage of his own calculation and finding, perhaps for the first time, that it had a human face he recognized. I'll tell you where she is, Salvatore said. And then, before Damien could move or Evelyn could process the shift, he said to his 6 men, very calmly, Take them. The warehouse erupted, not with gunshots, with bodies, moving fast, the 6 men collapsing the positions they'd held and crossing the space with professional speed. Damien moved at the same moment, not towards Salvatore's men, but laterally, putting himself between Evelyn and the nearest approach angle, and his left hand caught her arm and moved her behind the shelving unit in a motion so controlled that it felt like being redirected by a current rather than a person. Stay behind the cases, he said. Do not move from that position. Then he was gone, back into the center of the floor. She pressed herself against the climate-controlled shelving and listened to the sounds a body makes when it has committed to something physical and total. Impact, movement, the specific grunt of breath forced out under duress. She could see fragments through gaps in the shelving. Damien moving with an economy of motion that was trained and old, and not like anything she'd seen from him in the controlled spaces where she'd previously watched him move. Beto somewhere to the left, handling the second man. Marco, impossibly, holding his own against someone who outweighed him by 30 pounds. Because it turned out that Marco Moretti's diplomatic middle distance had been a choice rather than an inability. She stayed behind the cases for approximately 40 seconds. Then she heard Salvatore's footsteps moving toward the vehicle bay. Unhurried, deliberate. The footsteps of a man who had decided the situation had become someone else's problem to manage and was implementing his exit. She looked at the phone in her hand. No signal. She looked at the transit cases beside her, at the Tico registration labels, at the evidence that was the only real leverage any of them had. She thought, he's going to leave his men here, and he's going to go somewhere and make a call, and Lucia is going to disappear, and the artifacts are going to disappear, and everything she'd decoded in the last 20 hours was going to become an academic exercise. She stepped out from behind the shelving. She crossed the floor at a run. She didn't look at what Damien and Beto and Marco were doing in the center of the warehouse, because looking wouldn't help anything, and she had approximately 12 seconds before Salvatore reached the vehicle bay and the door closed behind him. "DeLuca," she said. He stopped. She hadn't expected that. She'd expected to have to say it louder, to put more into it. But he stopped on the name alone, and he turned and he looked at her with those light-gathering eyes. And she stopped too in the center of the floor, with combat happening 6 feet to her right, and she held up the phone. "I have all 11 registration labels," she said. "I have case numbers and country of origin and declared values. And I have the decoded ledger sequences that match every one of them to your financial accounts." She was breathing harder than she wanted to, but her voice was clear. "The photographs may not be transmitted yet, but I have them, and my memory is very good." She held his gaze. "I decoded a double-encrypted ledger in 6 hours. I can reproduce every column from memory, and I will, line by line, to every federal authority that will sit still long enough to listen. The artifacts, the accounts, the 6 people you framed to protect them. My father's case." She took a breath. "You can take the phone. You cannot take what I know." Salvatore DeLuca looked at her. The warehouse sounds continued behind her. She didn't look. "My father's file," she said. "You told me it was calculus, that you applied it because the alternative was worse." She kept her voice even because she had been keeping her voice even for 15 years, and she was very practiced at it. "Give me Lucia's location. Give me that much, and I will give you whatever head start this conversation buys you." "You'd bargain for the Falcone girl," he said. "Not for your father." "My father is already free," she said. "You can't give me back 19 years, but you can stop adding to the damage." She looked at him. "That's the only currency you have left that's worth anything." The vehicle bay door was 8 feet behind him. Damien appeared at her shoulder. She heard him a fraction of a second before he was there, his breathing controlled but fast, the particular rhythm of someone who had just put their body through something demanding and was already past it. His hand closed on her shoulder, light and brief, and communicating something she understood as, "I see you," and "Stay." Salvatore looked between them. At the woman with the phone and the knowledge she couldn't be stripped of. At the man he had raised and taught and underestimated in the one direction that mattered, which was the direction of how far Damien Moretti was willing to go for something he believed was right. He reached into his coat pocket. Every muscle in the warehouse went still. He produced a phone, dialed, said 4 words in Italian, ended the call. "The building on West 41st, he said, "the south side, 3rd floor. The door is unlocked." He looked at Damien. "I built you something worth having," he said. "That's the truth. Everything else is also the truth. Both things can be true." Damien said nothing. Salvatore walked to the vehicle bay. The door opened. The SUV's engine turned over. And then he was gone. And the warehouse was the 6 of them. Damien, Evelyn, Marco, Beto, Sal, and 2 of Salvatore's men who had stopped being a problem, in the flat industrial light, with 11 transit cases of stolen antiquities and a phone full of photographs that still had no signal. Marco was moving before the bay door fully closed, pulling out his own phone, heading for the personnel entrance where signal might be available, his whole body running ahead of his feet in the direction of West 41st Street. Beto went after him. Sal was checking the two men on the floor with the professional thoroughness of someone doing an assessment rather than expressing concern. Evelyn stood in the center of the warehouse and looked at the shelving, at the 11 transit cases, at the fluorescent light falling across the Tico labels and casting shadows through the registration codes she'd memorized 40 minutes ago and would be able to reproduce character by character for as long as her mind held what she'd built it to hold. Damien stood beside her, close enough that she could hear his breathing normalizing. His jacket was torn at the left shoulder. There was a cut above his right eyebrow that was bleeding in the specific, understated way cuts above eyebrows bled. Not dramatically, just persistently, the kind of thing that looked like less than it was. She looked at the cut. He didn't acknowledge it. "She bargained with me," he said. Not to her, to the warehouse, or to himself. "Salvatore," she said. "He gave up Lucia to get out of the building." He was looking at the transit cases. "Which means he's not done. He's not running. He's repositioning." She understood. "He still has something we don't know about. He spent 20 years building contingencies," Damien said. "One arrested exit doesn't end it." He looked at her. The cut above his eye was moving blood down the side of his face now, and he still wasn't acknowledging it. "You stepped out from behind the cases." "Yes. I told you not to move." "You did. And..." She looked at the vehicle bay where Salvatore's SUV had been. He was going to leave. Everything in the ledger was going to become historical record without physical corroboration. The artifacts needed to stay in this building until federal authorities can photograph them in situ. She met his eyes. "You needed 40 more seconds. I bought them." He looked at her for a moment that had several layers to it, the way moments had been having since the first one in the alley. She was beginning to understand that with Damien Moretti, the surface of a moment was rarely what the moment was actually about. "You told him your memory was good," he said. "It is." "You told him you decoded a double-encrypted ledger in 6 hours." "I had." "You were bargaining with your own mind," he said. "Your knowledge. As leverage." "It was all I had," she said. He was quiet for a beat. Most people in that situation would have hidden. "I've been hiding for 15 years, she said. "In a basement, restoring other people's masterpieces." She looked at the transit cases, at the damaged artifacts being held in a port warehouse, separated from their origins by theft and money and men who had decided the calculus was acceptable. "I'm done hiding." His phone buzzed. He looked at it. "Marco has her," he said. "Lucia. She's unharmed." The breath she let out was longer than she'd expected. She hadn't realized she'd been holding it. From the personnel door, Sal appeared. "We've got a problem," he said. "Of course we do," Damien said. "Carla called from the van. Before she..." Sal paused, recalibrating. "Her last transmission. She contacted someone outside the operation 20 minutes ago, before Salvatore's people arrived." "Who?" Damien said. "Renata's people picked it up on the monitored line. She contacted someone inside the federal building." Sal held out his own phone, showing a number. "That's a line registered to the Organized Crime Division." Evelyn looked at the number, then at Damien. "That's not necessarily bad," she said carefully. "It depends on which direction the relationship runs," Damien said. He was looking at the number with the expression of a man running permutations. "If Carla was feeding information about my operation to federal authorities, then Salvatore might have a federal problem arriving very shortly," she said. "Or I might," he said. "Or both," Sal said, unhelpfully. Damien pocketed the phone, looked at the warehouse, at the transit cases, at the personnel door and the vehicle bay and the exits and the angles, mapping the room again the way he'd mapped the Alderton house, not for escape, but for position. "We need the federal documentation for the artifacts filed before Salvatore can move them," Evelyn said. "If law enforcement is already in contact, if law enforcement was being fed information by Salvatore's source inside my operation," Damien said, "then the question is whether that information was being used to protect his interests or expose them, and right now I don't know the answer to that." She thought about the painting, about the person who had hidden it, about being chosen specifically, an Arthur Mercer's daughter, to find the thing that would break this open.
about the conservation timeline being accelerated by 3 weeks by a registrar who'd lied about donor instructions. "The painting," she said. Damien looked at her. "Someone built the evidence trail and hid it where I'd find it," she said. "You said yourself, that person is not Salvatore. That means there's been someone else working against him from inside. Someone who had access to the Moretti Circle's financial records, who could encode them and hide them, who knew enough about federal case procedure to include the prosecution account sequences as a reference." She was thinking aloud now, the way she thought through a restoration problem, following the logic of material and method. Someone who wanted these cases overturned. My father's case. The others. She looked at Damien. Someone with a reason to want Salvatore exposed that predates all of this. Damien's expression shifted. "What?" she said. He looked at the personnel door. "My father didn't die of natural causes," he said. The words came out flat and deliberate, each one placed with care. "The official determination was cardiac. I accepted it. Salvatore accepted it. Everyone accepted it." He paused. "My father died in 2009 at 58 years old in excellent health, 6 weeks after he apparently began a private audit of the family's financial structures. The warehouse was very cold. Someone inside knew he was looking," Evelyn said. "And someone outside knew why," Damien said, "and built a record in case it ever needed to be proven." From outside, at a distance that was getting less distant, she could hear the sound of sirens. Not one, multiple. The particular overlapping frequency of coordinated response, the kind that happened when several vehicles were headed to the same location from different approaches. "We have about 4 minutes, Sal said. "The photographs," Damien said to Evelyn. "Everything on that phone. Send it to this address." He recited a string of digits she memorized without writing down. "It's an encrypted external server. Whatever signal you can get from outside, use it." "And then what?" she said. "And then," he said, "we decide whether the people arriving in those vehicles are here to help us or arrest us." He looked at her. At the cut above his eye still bleeding its quiet persistence, at the torn shoulder of his jacket, at the warehouse full of stolen history around them, and the sirens outside getting louder. "There's a third option," she said. "Which is, we make that decision for them," she said. "We walk out the front of this building with the phone and the documentation, and we tell them exactly what's here and what it connects to, and we make it impossible for whatever instructions they may have received from wherever Carla sent them to be the story. We make the artifacts the story. We make the framing cases the story." She held his gaze. "We make your father's audit the story." Damien looked at her for a long, specific moment. Then he said, "You've stopped being a conservator." "I've stopped pretending I'm only a conservator," she said. He turned toward the personnel door. "Send the photographs," he said. "You have 3 minutes." She was already moving toward the exit, and the signal and the Chicago morning coming in cold and copper off the lake. And behind her the warehouse held its stolen cargo and its industrial light, and the specific silence of a place where something enormous had just shifted and not yet decided which way it was going to. She got signal 12 feet outside the personnel door. 3 bars. Enough. She sent the photographs to the encrypted address Damien had given her and watched the progress bar move across the screen with the particular patience of someone who has learned that some things cannot be hurried without being broken. The morning air hit her face and smelled like diesel and lake water and the distant cold that was still coming off the ice somewhere north, the last of it, the season not quite ready to let go. Behind her, the warehouse held its cargo and its light. In front of her, coming from the north access road and the south perimeter simultaneously, the sirens were close enough now to feel in her chest alongside her heartbeat. She watched the photographs transmit. All 11 registration labels, all 11 cases in frame. The evidence sitting on climate-controlled shelving in a Chicago waterfront warehouse, documented by a woman standing outside a personnel door in borrowed boots with turpentine in the grain of her hands. 100%. Transmitted. She went back inside. Damien was at the center of the floor when she returned, his phone to his ear, speaking in a low and precise Italian that she didn't need to translate because the quality of it said everything. Not a negotiation, not a threat. A statement. The kind of statement made once without repetition,
by a man who had calculated what he was going to say before he picked up the phone and was now delivering it with the efficiency of someone who expected to be understood. He ended the call, looked at her. "Photograph sent," she said. "The federal line Carla used," he said. "I know whose number it is." She waited. "Andrea Voss," he said. "Assistant Special Agent in Charge, Organized Crime Division. She has been building the case against the Moretti Circle for 4 years." He paused. "Specifically against Salvatore De Luca. Under the Moretti name because that was the name on the structures she could see, but she's been unable to access the financial layer beneath it." His jaw moved. "Carla wasn't feeding her information about my operation to protect Salvatore. She was feeding information about Salvatore's operation to build the case Voss couldn't build from the outside." Evelyn absorbed this. Carla was working for Voss. "Carla was working for both of us," Damien said. "Selectively. She gave Voss enough to track the terminal. She kept enough back to protect the people in my operation who weren't part of what Salvatore built." He looked at the personnel door. "She told Voss to come here this morning. She set this up." "She set the conclusion up," he said. "The rest of it, the painting, you, the ledger, that was already in motion." He looked at her directly. "Someone sent Voss the painting's donation documentation 8 months ago. Anonymous tip. That's what put her attention on this terminal, on the import codes." He paused. "The same person who hid the ledger." The sirens stopped. The sudden quiet was enormous. "They're at the perimeter," Sal said from somewhere near the vehicle bay. Damien looked at Evelyn. "We walk out together," he said. "You speak first. The artifacts, the registration codes, the federal prosecution cases." He held her gaze. "They need to hear it from you, not from me. Because they won't trust it from you. Because you are the one who found it," he said, "and because you are Arthur Mercer's daughter, and that name is in their case files. And it will mean something when you say what that account number connects to." She thought about standing in the museum basement with a UV lamp and a scalpel and the particular Friday night silence that she had loved because it asked nothing of her. She thought about her father's handwriting in letters that arrived every 3 weeks for 19 years, careful and even, never asking her to do anything she didn't want to do. She thought about 19 years. "Okay," she said. They walked out the personnel door into the Chicago morning. There were 8 federal vehicles at the perimeter, and the men and women coming out of them moved with the organized urgency of people who had been briefed and were executing, not improvising. The first agent to reach them was a woman in her late 40s, compact and pale-eyed, with the bearing of someone who had been awake for a long time and had made her peace with it. She looked at Damien first, the instinct of someone whose file on him was thick, and then at Evelyn, and something in her expression recalibrated. "Andrea Voss," she said. "Evelyn Mercer," Evelyn said. "I need to show you something inside." Voss looked at Damien. "He comes too," Evelyn said. "He's the reason any of this is documented." Voss held Damien's gaze for 3 seconds. He said nothing. He didn't need to. "Inside," Voss said. They went back through the personnel door for the 3rd time that morning, and Evelyn stood beside the shelving units and told Andrea Voss everything she had decoded in the last 20 hours in the organized sequence of someone presenting findings rather than making an argument, the way she had once presented her research to peer reviewers and museum committees, and the one federal grant committee she'd addressed in 2018 about conservation funding. She walked Voss through the column structure, the base interval encoding, the name tier, the account tier, the location strings, the secondary layer and what it connected to, the prosecution documentation and the account sequence that appeared in both. She did not show weakness. She did not show grief. She presented the information and let it be what it was, which was enough. When she said her father's name, Voss's expression didn't change, but the pen she was taking notes with stopped moving for exactly 1 second. "United States versus Mercer," Voss said. "Account sequence 774, Evelyn said. "In your prosecution documentation and in the ledger's secondary layer. Same account. Different name attached to it in the prosecution record." Voss looked at the transit cases on the shelving, at the TICO labels, at the evidence sitting in fluorescent light that had been waiting, in various forms, for a long time to be seen by the right person. "Where's De Luca now?" Voss said. He left through the vehicle bay approximately 25 minutes ago, Damien said. It was the first thing he'd said since they came back inside. His voice was even, and he was standing slightly behind Evelyn, positioned not subordinately but supportively, the way a person stood when they were letting someone else carry the weight of a moment and making sure they had room to do it. "We have his vehicle tagged," Voss said to one of the agents beside her. Then, back to Damien, "You're going to need to come in." "I know," he said. "Today." "I know," he said again. Voss looked at him with the expression of a woman who had spent 4 years building a case against a name and was now standing in the physical location of her evidence in the company of the man that name belonged to, making rapid adjustments to her understanding of the geometry. "You're not what I expected," she said. "No one ever is," Damien said. It took 4 hours for the terminal to become a federal scene. Voss's team photographed every case, cataloged every registration label, processed the floor for forensic evidence with the methodical patience of people doing permanent work. Beto and Sal were questioned and released. Marco arrived at the terminal with Lucia at 9:15, both of them looking like people who had been through something that had clarified them in ways that would take time to fully understand. Lucia Falcone, who turned out to be entirely herself and not a mechanism or an innocent bystander, but a woman who absorbed the information about what her engagement had been built on, with the particular steadiness of someone who had understood for a while that something was structurally wrong and had been waiting for the specific truth of it, sat in the back of a federal vehicle with Marco's hand in hers and talked to a junior agent for 90 minutes with the precise detail of someone who had been paying very close attention to the last 2 years of her life. Salvatore De Luca was taken into federal custody at 10:47 that morning. He was found at an address on the North Shore, in a house that was registered under a corporate entity that had taken Voss's team 6 months to trace, and that turned out to be the same corporate entity that had processed the museum donation 18 months ago. He offered no resistance. He made one phone call to an attorney and said nothing further. Voss told Evelyn this herself in a brief conversation outside the terminal, while the processing continued inside. "He didn't run," Evelyn said. "No," Voss said, "because he knew it was over. Because he's 71 years old and he spent 50 years building something," Voss said, without particular sympathy. "Men like that don't run. They sit in what they built, and they wait for you to come to them." She paused. "Or that's my read." "Who hid the ledger?" Evelyn said. Voss looked at her. "In the painting," Evelyn said. "Someone built that evidence trail and hid it where I'd find it. Someone sent you the donation documentation. Someone moved up my conservation timeline so I'd be looking at it within the window they needed." She held Voss's gaze. "You know who it was." Voss was quiet for a moment. That was not evasion. It was decision. "The tip I received 8 months ago," she said. "Anonymous, but the source was sophisticated. The documentation was encoded in a way that told me whoever sent it understood federal evidence procedure very specifically. I had my people try to trace it." She paused. The encoding structure matched a method used in federal case documentation from the late 1990s, DOJ internal, the kind of thing a federal employee would know. The cold air off the lake, the sound of the processing happening inside. "My father," Evelyn said. "Arthur Mercer worked as a financial consultant to the DOJ's Organized Crime Task Force from 1993 to 1998, Voss said, before his arrest. He had access to federal evidence encoding standards. He would have known exactly how to build a record that would survive and be recognizable to someone inside the system." She looked at Evelyn steadily. "Your father built that ledger. We don't know when. It may have been before his arrest, if he suspected what was happening. Or it may have been assembled from records he had access to through the task force work." She paused. "He hid it in the painting. He arranged the donation through an intermediary we're still identifying. And 8 months ago, from whatever situation he found himself in after his release, he sent me the tip." Evelyn stood in the cold morning and looked at the lake, which was visible at the end of the service road as a flat gray line between the industrial structures. Immense and indifferent, the way it always was, carrying its own enormous weight from one shore to the other without commenting on any of the human business happening along its edges. Her father had spent 19 years in a federal correctional facility. And at some point in those 19 years, or before them, He had built the instrument of his own vindication and hidden it in a painting and waited. Not passively. Her father, she was understanding now, had never been passive. He had waited with intent, with planning, with the specific long patience of a man who understood that some corrections took time and required the right person at the right moment looking in the right direction. He had pointed the light at her. He had trusted her to find it. She had not visited after the second year. She pressed her thumbnail into her palm. Not hard, just enough to feel it. "Thank you," she said to Voss. "Don't thank me yet," Voss said. "The case is going to take months, possibly a year. DeLuca's attorney is good. The 6 wrongful convictions are going to require individual review proceedings." She paused. "Your father's case is the strongest because we have the direct account linkage, but even that—" "I know how these things work," Evelyn said. Voss looked at her. "Yes," she said. "I suppose you do." She drove herself to her father's apartment at noon. She had borrowed Sal's car, which was not a car she would have chosen under other circumstances, but was functional and had a full tank of gas and didn't require her to explain anything to anyone. She drove through Chicago in the April midday light, through the neighborhoods that looked ordinary and were, mostly, which was the thing about this city that she had always found both comforting and strange, its capacity to contain enormous things in its ordinary geography, to run the whole range of human extremity through the same streets where people walked dogs and bought coffee and sent their children to school. Her father lived in a 2-room apartment in Pilsen, 14 months out of a federal facility and 14 months into the process of becoming a person who lived in an apartment in Pilsen, which was not a fast process and was not supposed to be. She had his address because he had sent it to her when he got out, in a letter that was careful and even, and did not ask her for anything she didn't want to give. She had not visited. She sat in the borrowed car outside his building for 6 minutes. Then she got out. He answered on the second knock. He was 62 years old and looked older than that, the way incarceration aged people not through cruelty alone, but through the specific deprivation of choosing how to spend your own time, which turned out to be something the body needed as much as it needed food. His hair was completely white. He was thinner than she remembered. His eyes were the same eyes she'd been using for 15 years to look at things that most people walked past, the eyes she'd inherited along with the particular stubbornness of someone who believed that what was hidden could be found if you were willing to look long enough. He looked at her. She looked at him. "I found it," she said. His expression did something that was too complex and too old and too long in coming to describe as any single thing. It was the expression of a man receiving information he had structured his entire last 2 decades around the possibility of, and finding that the arrival of it was both exactly what he'd imagined and entirely different. He stepped back from the door. She went inside. The apartment was small and ordered in the way of a person who had spent years in a space where order was the only thing they controlled and had kept the habit. Books on shelves, organized by subject, a table with 2 chairs, a window that looked onto an alley that had a single tree at the end of it, still bare in the early April cold but budding at the tips in the way that was always more hopeful than it had any right to be. She sat down at the table and he sat across from her and she told him. Not everything could. There wasn't time and the case was still open, and some of it he would need to hear from his attorney, who would be contacted by Voss's office before the end of the day. But enough. The painting, the ledger, the account sequence, his name on the wrong side of a substitution that had taken a federal task force and his own daughter and a crime lord with complicated motivations to unravel 19 years after the fact. He listened the way he always had, completely, without interrupting, with the particular quality of attention she had inherited and had spent her professional life applying to objects rather than people. When she finished, the apartment was quiet. "The painting," he said. "Was it badly damaged?" She stared at him. "I commissioned it through a restorer I knew in Florence," he said. "He did excellent work. I was concerned about the canvas weight under the resin layer." A pause. "I had hoped it would survive." "The upper right corner," she said. "I cut it out in a hurry, and it caught on something during—" She stopped. "Dad." "Yes." "You built it." "Yes." "Before you were arrested." "I began to suspect what was happening in the summer of 1997, he said. I had access to the task force's evidence documentation. I recognized some of the account structures. I knew enough to understand that when it unraveled, and I believed it would unravel, eventually, the evidence would need to be something that couldn't be dismissed as fabricated after the fact. It needed to predate the arrest. He looked at his hands on the table. The painting was the only container I could think of that would survive long-term storage without deteriorating and that would require a specific skill set to read. A skill set I knew you would have. He paused. I arranged the donation 18 months ago when I was released and had access to the intermediary again. I adjusted the conservation schedule through a contact at the museum. Price, she said. He was a student of mine, her father said. He owed me a favor. He didn't know what he was doing, just a timeline adjustment. He looked at her. I needed it to be you who found it. Someone else might have missed the UV layer, or found it and not known what they were looking at. Or found it and not had any reason to pursue it, she said. Yes, he said. She looked at her hands, at the grain of turpentine still in the skin that no amount of washing fully removed, at the trace evidence of 15 years of careful work on other people's broken things. You pointed the light at me, she said. You were always the person most likely to look in the right direction, he said. I just needed to make sure you were in the room. The tree at the end of the alley was budding at the tips. She looked at it through the window for a moment because sometimes you needed to look at something that wasn't a person when the thing a person had said was large enough to require its own space. I didn't come, she said. After the second year, I should have come. He was quiet for a moment. You were 19 years old, he said, and you had a life to build. I didn't want you building it around visiting hours. I thought, she started and stopped. You thought I might be what they said I was, he said. Not an accusation, a fact, offered with the equanimity of someone who had had a long time to make peace with the harder truths of what people needed to believe to survive. That's all right. It's not, she said. No, he agreed, but it's done. And you're here now. She looked at him across the small table in the small apartment in Pilsen with the April light coming through the window and the evidence already transmitted and Salvatore De Luca in federal custody and the 6 wrongful conviction files now on Andrea Voss's desk. She thought about what it cost to wait, to build something and hide it and trust that the right person would eventually look in the right direction, even when the right person was someone who had stopped visiting after the second year. She thought, he knew I would find it. He had known that long before she knew it herself. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He looked down at it, and then he didn't look away. They sat there in the quiet of the apartment for a long time without saying anything else, because some things had been said enough, and the rest of it was not language, but the particular warmth of a physical fact. A hand on a hand, 2 people at a table, the ordinary miracle of being in the same room at the same time and choosing not to leave. She drove back downtown in the late afternoon. The city was in the specific gold light of a Chicago April evening, the light that came at an angle off the lake and turned even the concrete and the steel into something warmer than they were. She drove through it and thought about Damien, who was in a federal building somewhere giving a statement that would take the rest of the day and probably part of tomorrow, guided by an attorney whose number she suspected he had memorized the same way he memorized exits and camera positions and the operational logic of rooms he walked into. She thought about the things she knew about him now that she had not known when he stepped out of the rain in an alley on West Kinsey. That he moved through space with the specific awareness of someone who had spent a long time understanding that the difference between alive and not was often 3 feet and a decision made 2 seconds earlier. That he kept a mechanical watch because it didn't need a signal. That he had read her 2019 paper 3 times and retained enough of it to recognize that she was the right person to decode something built with archival logic. That he was capable of enormous and sustained control, and that beneath it ran something less controlled that he was very careful about when he let it out. She thought about the cabin they hadn't gone to yet, about the snow and the exhaustion and the walls between them that the outline had promised would collapse, which was not how her life worked or had ever worked, which was precisely why she was thinking about it. She was thinking about it. That was already a change. She parked and walked to the West Loop apartment because she had a key. Carla had given it to her the first morning, which she now understood was not generosity but intelligence gathering. and which she had decided to retain on the grounds that the information Carla had gathered had ended up pointed in a useful direction regardless of the motive. She went upstairs and she stood in the apartment that smelled like 3 days of crisis and old coffee and opened the window that looked north toward the river. The river was moving fast in the spring melt, carrying upstream weight at a pace that looked almost purposeful. She was looking at it when she heard the door. Damien came in at 7:30. He looked like a man who had spent 6 hours in a federal building giving precise statements, which was to say he looked tired in a way that was deeper than physical, and had the slightly stunned quality of someone who had delivered a large amount of information and was now existing in the hollow that information had occupied. He stopped when he saw her at the window. She turned around. He looked at her for a moment. "Your father," he said. "I went," she said. "This afternoon." He nodded. One small movement. "The case," she said. "Voss's office is filing the wrongful conviction petitions next week, all 6. My father's first because the account linkage is direct. The others will take longer." She paused. "She says the artifacts will be repatriated through the relevant cultural heritage authorities. It'll take time to identify origins and establish return protocols, but the physical evidence is solid." "And DeLuca," he said. "In custody. His attorney is good. It'll be a long case." She looked at him. "Your name is on structures he built. Some of them will be difficult to separate cleanly." "I know," he said. "Voss is not hostile to the idea of cooperation," she said. "She told me that specifically, which I think was meant to be communicated." "I'll call her attorney," he said. "She doesn't want your attorney," Evelyn said. "She wants you." He was quiet. "You spent 12 years running an empire that was built on something you didn't choose," she said. "And when you found out what was under it, you drove to a federal terminal at dawn and stood in a warehouse and let me walk out the front door with the evidence." She held his gaze. Voss is a good reader of people. She knows what that means. He came away from the door, moved into the room to the table, which was still covered in her notes and the printed sequences and the decoded columns. He looked at them, reached out and touched the edge of the paper she'd decoded her father's name on, very lightly, and then withdrew his hand. "Marco and Lucia are in the building on Division Street," he said. "She's not going back to her father until she and Marco have had about 6 conversations about what exactly she's walked into. Marco is," he paused, "Marco is good. Better than I expected. Better than the situation deserved." "He's stronger than he looks," she said. "He always was," Damien said. "I just forgot to look." The apartment was quiet in the way it had been the first night, after the drive through the rain, before any of this had names. She looked at him in the gold fading light and thought about what 12 hours and 6 hours and 20 hours and 2 days could do to the distance between people. Not eliminate it, not pretend it didn't exist, but make its geography specific, nameable. Something you could choose to cross rather than something that simply stood between you. "The painting," he said. "The conservator who made the original." "The Florence Commission," she said. "My father told me." "We'll need to document the original construction," he said, "for the case. How it was built, the encoding method, the resin compound. The judge will want technical testimony establishing that the ledger inside it predates the arrest." He looked at her. "You're the only person qualified to give that testimony." "I know," she said. "You'll need to stay in contact with the case," he said, "with Voss's office, for months, possibly longer." "I know." He looked at her directly. "And after." The word hung in the room. After. Such a small word for everything it was trying to hold. "I'm a conservator," she said. "I preserve things. I look at what's damaged and I figure out what can be recovered and what's already gone, and I work with what's actually there." She paused. "That's not nothing, as skills go." He looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said. "It's not nothing." She moved to the table and gathered her notes into their working order, not because she needed them right now, but because her hands needed something to do while the room settled into whatever it was going to be. "There's a question," she said. "What?" "The warehouse. The man by the fireplace at the reception. The first night, the men from the museum." She looked at him. Someone in Salvatore's network knew about the painting 8 months ago when my father sent the tip to Voss. They moved the timeline up, yes, to get it in front of me before Voss could execute through official channels. But they also must have known that accelerating the timeline would accelerate all of it, the whole sequence. She tilted her head. Salvatore's people were reactive throughout. They were responding to our timeline, not driving it. Yes, Damien said. Your father's audit, she said. The one he was conducting when he died. You said he died 6 weeks into it. Yes. Who knew he was auditing? Damien sat down. It was the same specific way he'd sat down in the printing facility, the weight of something large and heavy deciding to be closer to the ground. Salvatore, he said, and one other person, a man named Ferretti, who was the family's internal accountant at the time. He paused. Ferretti died in 2011, also cardiac. She sat down across from him. Your father started an audit, she said. He died. Ferretti knew he was auditing. Ferretti died. My father built a hidden record in 1997 or 1998 before his arrest, which means he was already suspicious of the account structures by then, which means the operation Salvatore was building was already visible to someone paying close enough attention. And 8 months ago, my father sent the tip that put all of this in motion. She looked at him. What if the audit in 2009 wasn't the beginning of Salvatore's move against the family? What if it was the middle? Damien was looking at the notes on the table. What if your father found what my father was looking for, she said. And Salvatore knew. And Salvatore acted. And what looked like a cardiac event was, stop, Damien said. She stopped. The word had come out quiet and complete. Not angry. Something harder than angry and older than it. She waited. I know, he said. I've known for 3 years, since I started tracking the terminal. He pressed 2 fingers to the table. I didn't say it because saying it makes it a thing I have to act on. And acting on it the way the part of me that is a Moretti wants to act on it would make me the same thing I spent 20 years trying not to become. She said nothing. There will be a point in the case, he said, where the federal investigation covers enough ground that what happened in 2009 becomes visible to people who can address it through channels that don't require me to make a choice I can't undo. He looked up. That's the plan. That's been the plan since I started tracking this terminal and understood what I was looking at. She held his gaze. That's a very long plan. Yes, he said. It is. She thought about patience, about her father building a ledger in 1997 and hiding it in a painting and waiting 26 years for it to be found by the right person at the right moment. About Damien spending 2 years watching a terminal, building towards something that required the right sequence rather than the fastest one. Some people, she was learning, thought in the same time frame as the damage. Okay, she said. He looked at her. Okay, she said again. That's the plan. Something in his face changed, not dramatically, the way light changed in a painting when you cleaned the varnish. The same colors, just clearer, just more themselves. 8 months later, the Arthur Mercer Renaissance Wing opened at the Chicago Museum of Antiquities on a Saturday evening in December, and the city's elite gathered under the restored chandeliers and the camera flashes and the particular self-congratulatory energy of people who had donated money to something and were pleased to see what it looked like. The wing was named for the man whose testimony had broken open the most significant organized crime prosecution in Chicago history, resulting in 37 federal charges, 14 convictions including DeLuca's, and the formal exoneration of 6 individuals who had served a combined 91 years in federal custody. Arthur Mercer, who had spent 19 years in prison for a crime committed against him by the very network he'd once helped investigate, stood in the first gallery of the wing that bore his name and looked at the painting on the wall, the restored portrait, the damaged corner invisibly mended by a conservator who had spent 6 weeks on that 2 inches of canvas alone, and said very little. He didn't need to say much. The work said it. Evelyn arrived at 7:30 in something liquid and gold that Carla had sourced, because Carla was still in her life in the reduced and reconfigured way that people who had been both useful and complicated tended to remain. Not close, but present. Not trusted the way she'd been trusted at the beginning, but understood in a way that turned out to be more durable. She walked into the gallery, and the room reorganized itself around her the same way it had reorganized itself at the Alderton House reception, except this time it was doing it for different reasons. Because she was different now. Not in the way of a person who had been transformed by circumstance into something else entirely, but in the way of a person who had discovered capabilities they'd been carrying the whole time and was now simply using them. Damien was there. He was always there early to rooms he intended to control. She knew this about him now. She knew a number of things about him now that she hadn't known in the alley on West Kinsey, the way you knew more about a painting after you'd worked on it than before. Not because the painting had changed, but because you had spent time with it in the specific concentrated way that made the layers visible. He was standing beside her father, which she hadn't expected, and they were looking at the restored portrait together with the expressions of two people who had both spent a significant amount of time inside the same problem and were now standing on the other side of it looking back. She crossed the room to them. Her father looked at her. His expression was the complex one she'd seen at the apartment table, but lighter now, as if some of the specific weight of it had been redistributed by time and process, and the specific relief of having been formally, publicly, on the record, seen. "The corner," he said, looking at the painting. "You can't see it." "That was the point," she said. He smiled. It was not a large smile. It was the size of something that had been waiting to exist and was now, carefully, doing so. She stood between them for a moment, and then Damien touched her arm, lightly, the way he touched her arm in rooms now. Not claiming, not directing, just communicating, and they moved to the edge of the gallery where the crowd thinned. "Voss sends her regards," he said. "She was here earlier," Evelyn said. "I saw her by the East Gallery." "She leaves early from things," he said. "Professional habit." "The Ferretti case," she said. "The 2011 investigation." "Reopened," he said. "As of this morning. The evidence that came out of the DeLuca proceedings was sufficient to trigger a formal review." He paused. "It'll take another year, maybe two." She nodded. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a key. Small, unremarkable, the kind of key that came with a safety deposit box or a storage unit or something that held things of value in a secured and neutral location. "What is that?" she said. "Every code to the financial structures that survived the federal proceedings," he said. "Accounts, contacts, operational assets. Everything that Voss's office has cleared, everything that's been verified as clean." He held it out. "And the ones that are still being cleaned. All of it." She looked at the key. "That's not a gift," she said. "No," he said. "It's a position." He held her gaze. "I've been running this alone since I was 28. I've been running it with structural rot I didn't know about, building on a foundation that was poisoned before I touched it. And He paused, and she heard in the pause the specific quality of a man who had calculated his words and had come to the end of what calculation could do and was now in territory that required something else. "I would like to not do it alone anymore. That is the clearest way I know how to say it." She looked at the key. At the painting on the wall above them, the restored portrait with its invisible repair, the man in dark velvet, whose ordinary face hid two layers of something extraordinary. At her father across the room, talking to a city alderman with the precise and careful energy of a man who had learned that words had weight and was spending them accordingly. She thought about the basement, the UV lamp, the Friday night silence that she had loved because it asked nothing of her. She thought about what it had asked of her in the end, what she'd given, what she'd found. She took the key. Damien looked at her hand holding it. Something in his face did the thing it did. Cleared, like varnish coming off a surface, revealing what was underneath, which was not soft and was not simple, but was unmistakably there. "I have conditions," she said. "I expected you would. The 6 exonerations. Whatever resources you have access to that can support the reintegration process for those individuals. Housing, legal, financial. That happens." "It's already happening," he said. "The antiquities," she said. "The repatriation process. I'm consulting on the cultural heritage protocols. Officially." "I told Voss that myself," he said. "And my father's wing gets proper endowment funding. Not from you. From the museum's legitimate board contacts. Clean money, publicly sourced." "Done 3 months ago," he said. She looked at him. "I've been working on the conditions for a while," he said. She looked at the key in her hand, at the gold light of the gallery,
At the city beyond the museum windows, visible in the reflection of the glass as a skyline that was enormous and indifferent and full of everything that people did to each other, in the dark and the daylight both. All of it continuing, all of it in motion, the permanent, impossible complexity of a place where the full range of human behavior existed within walking distance of where you were standing at any given moment. She thought, "You cannot restore what you refuse to look at." She closed her hand around the key, and in the Arthur Mercer Renaissance wing of the Chicago Museum of Antiquities, on a December evening with the lake wind against the windows and the city going about its enormous business outside, Evelyn Mercer, who had spent 15 years in a basement restoring other people's masterpieces, pocketed the key and looked at the man beside her and at the painting above them and at the room full of people who had no idea what it had cost to get here or what it was going to cost going forward. And she found, to her considerable surprise, that the not knowing didn't frighten her. She had looked at worse things under worse light and found what was hidden in them. She could do it again. She would do it again. That was who she was now. The archivist who had gone into the dark with a scalpel and a UV lamp and come out carrying the weight of something that turned out to be worth carrying, standing beside the man who had once offered her two choices in a rain-soaked alley and had not anticipated that she would make a third one. She had always been better at finding hidden things than anyone expected. Now she had somewhere to put what she found. She looked up at the portrait on the wall. The man in dark velvet, restored. The invisible corner mended so perfectly that you would have to know exactly where to look to find the seam. You would have to know how to look at all. She did. End.